would you risk for love? When a princess falls for a peasant, the kingdom's silence turns to uproar. But what happens next? No one could have foreseen. Thank you so much for watching and for all your comments. Let me know at the end if you liked the story, and where you're watching from and why you're following this. The cold autumn wind swept through the stone corridors of Thornhaven Castle, carrying with it the scent of rain and dying leaves. Princess Isabel stood at the narrow window of her chamber, her slender fingers pressed against the cold glass as she gazed out at the sprawling kingdom below. The landscape stretched endlessly before her, a tapestry of rolling hills, dense forests, and small villages that dotted the countryside like stars scattered across a dark canvas. Her long chestnut hair, intricately braided with silver threads, cascaded down her back over a gown of deep burgundy wool lined with soft gray fur at the collar and cuffs. The dress was tailored perfectly to her frame, its long sleeves embroidered with intricate patterns of ivy and roses in golden thread, a testament to her royal status. Yet despite the richness of her attire, there was a heaviness in her heart that no amount of finery could alleviate. Isabel was 20 years old, with striking features that had captured the attention of nobles and commoners alike throughout the realm. Her eyes were a piercing shade of green, framed by dark lashes that gave her gaze an intensity that could silence a room. Her lips, naturally rose-colored, were often pressed into a thin line of determination, for she possessed a spirit far more rebellious than her father, King Richard, would have preferred. She was the eldest of 3 children, the only daughter, and therefore the subject of constant scrutiny and expectation. Every move she made, every word she spoke, was analyzed by the court, dissected by advisors, and reported back to her father with meticulous detail. The chamber around her was spacious but austere, befitting a princess who had never cared much for excessive decoration. The stone walls were covered with tapestries depicting scenes of ancient battles and heroic deeds, their colors faded with age. A large canopied bed dominated one corner of the room, its heavy curtains of dark green velvet drawn back to reveal thick wool blankets and fur pelts piled high for warmth. A wooden chest sat at the foot of the bed, its iron lock rusted but secure, containing the few personal treasures Isabel possessed. Near the window stood a small writing desk, its surface cluttered with parchment, quills, and a half-empty bottle of ink. It was here that Isabel spent most of her private hours, writing poetry and letters that she knew would never be sent. A soft knock at the door pulled her from her reverie. She turned, her expression guarded, and called out in a clear voice that carried the authority of her position. "Enter." The heavy wooden door creaked open, and a young woman stepped inside, her head bowed respectfully. This was Catherine, Isabel's lady-in-waiting and closest confidant. She was 22, with kind brown eyes and auburn hair pinned back beneath a simple linen coif. Her dress was modest compared to Isabel's, a practical gown of dark blue wool with minimal embroidery, cinched at the waist with a leather belt. Despite her lower status, Catherine moved with a grace and confidence that suggested she was far more than just a servant. "Your Highness," Catherine began, her voice gentle but laced with concern, "your father has requested your presence in the Great Hall. Lord Pembroke has arrived from the Northern Territories, and the King wishes to introduce you." Isabel's jaw tightened, and she turned back to the window, her hands clasping together in front of her. She had been expecting this. For weeks, rumors had circulated throughout the castle that King Richard was seeking a suitable match for his daughter, someone who could strengthen political alliances and secure the kingdom's future. Lord Pembroke was a powerful nobleman, wealthy and influential, but Isabel had heard whispers of his cruelty and his insatiable hunger for power. The thought of being paraded before him like a prize mare made her stomach turn. "Tell my father I will attend shortly," Isabel said quietly, her voice betraying none of the turmoil she felt inside. Catherine hesitated, taking a step closer. "My lady, if I may speak freely." Isabel turned to face her, a sad smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "You always do, Catherine. What troubles you?" "I know this is not what you desire," Catherine said carefully, choosing her words with the precision of someone who understood the delicate balance of court politics. "But perhaps it would be wise to at least hear what Lord Pembroke has to offer. Your father's patience grows thin, and the council presses him daily to see you wed." Isabel walked across the room and sank into the cushioned chair near the fireplace, where a modest fire crackled and popped, casting dancing shadows on the walls. She stared into the flames, her mind wandering to a place far from the confines of the castle, to a memory that brought both joy and pain in equal measure. "Do you remember the market festival last spring?" Isabel asked, her voice distant, as though she were speaking to herself rather than to Catherine. Catherine's expression softened, and she moved to stand beside the princess, her hand resting gently on the back of the chair. "I remember, my lady. I had never seen anything so vibrant, so full of life," Isabel continued, her eyes still fixed on the fire. "The merchants calling out their wares, the children running through the streets, the smell of fresh bread and roasted meat, and the people, Catherine. They were so free. They laughed without fear, spoke their minds without consequence. I envied them." It was true. 6 months earlier, Isabel had convinced her father to allow her to attend the annual harvest festival in the village of Redbrook, a small settlement located at the edge of the royal forests. It had taken weeks of persuasion, and even then, the king had only agreed on the condition that she be accompanied by a contingent of guards and remain veiled to avoid recognition. But Isabel had been determined, and for one glorious afternoon, she had tasted a freedom she had never known. The festival had been a riot of color and sound. Stalls lined the narrow streets, selling everything from fresh produce and hand-woven fabrics to iron tools and leather goods. Musicians played lively tunes on lutes and drums, and dancers twirled in the center of the square, their laughter infectious. Isabel had wandered through the crowd, her heart soaring with each new sight and sound, feeling more alive than she had in years. And then she had seen him. He was working at a blacksmith's stall, his broad shoulders straining against a simple tunic of rough-spun linen as he hammered a piece of glowing iron into shape. His dark hair was damp with sweat, clinging to his forehead, and his arms, bare to the elbows, were corded with muscle from years of hard labor. But it was his face that had captured her attention, a face that seemed to belong more to a hero from the old tales than to a common blacksmith. His features were strong and symmetrical, with a square jaw shadowed by stubble, high cheekbones, and eyes the color of storm clouds. There was an intensity to him, a focus and determination that reminded Isabel of the great warriors depicted in the tapestries that adorned her chamber walls. She had stopped walking, her feet rooted to the cobblestones, and simply watched him work. There was a rhythm to his movements, a practiced precision that spoke of years spent perfecting his craft. Each strike of the hammer was deliberate, controlled, and the sound of metal on metal rang out like a heartbeat. Isabel found herself mesmerized, unable to look away. It was Catherine who had finally broken the spell, tugging gently on her sleeve and whispering urgently that they needed to keep moving before the guards grew suspicious. But as Isabel turned to leave, the blacksmith had looked up, and their eyes had met. For a brief, electrifying moment, the world around them had seemed to fade away, leaving only the two of them standing in the midst of the bustling crowd. He had smiled then, a slow, genuine smile that reached his eyes and made Isabel's heart skip a beat. And then she had been pulled away, swallowed back into the sea of people, leaving her with nothing but the memory of that smile and the strange, exhilarating feeling it had stirred within her. "You think of him often, don't you?" Catherine's voice was soft, understanding. Isabel blinked, pulling herself back to the present. She looked up at her friend, and for a moment, the carefully constructed mask of composure she wore slipped, revealing the vulnerability beneath. "Every day," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know it's foolish. I know nothing can come of it. But I cannot help myself, Catherine. When I close my eyes, I see his face. I hear the sound of his hammer, the way he moved with such purpose and strength. And I wonder what it would be like to live a life where I could choose for myself, where my heart could lead me instead of duty and obligation." Catherine knelt beside the chair, taking Isabel's hands in her own. "You are not foolish, my lady. You are human. But you must be careful. If your father were to discover these feelings, if the court were to learn of your interest in a commoner, the consequences would be severe, not just for you, but for him as well." Isabel knew Catherine was right. The rigid hierarchy of medieval England left no room for such fantasies. A princess was meant to marry a prince or a powerful lord, to forge alliances that would protect the kingdom and ensure its prosperity. Love, if it came at all, was an afterthought, a fortunate accident rather than a prerequisite. The idea of a royal falling for a peasant was not just scandalous, it was dangerous. It could be seen as a betrayal of one's duty, a rejection of the very order that held society together. And yet, despite knowing all this, Isabel could not silence the longing in her heart. "I will be careful," Isabel said finally, rising from the chair and straightening her gown. "But I will not give up hope. Not yet." Catherine stood as well, her expression a mixture of admiration and worry. "Then let us go to the great hall and face whatever awaits us there. But promise me, my lady, that you will guard your heart as carefully as you guard your words." Isabel nodded, and together they left the chamber, making their way through the winding corridors of Thornhaven Castle. The walls were lined with torches that flickered and sputtered in their iron sconces, casting long shadows that seemed to chase them as they walked. The air was thick with the smell of burning wood and damp stone, and the distant sound of voices echoed through the passageways, mingling with the clatter of armor and the scurrying of servants going about their duties. As they descended the spiral staircase that led to the main level of the castle, Isabel's thoughts drifted once more to the blacksmith. She didn't even know his name, yet he occupied her mind with a persistence that both thrilled and terrified her. What was it about him that had captivated her so completely? Was it his strength, his quiet confidence, or simply the fact that he represented everything she could never have? She didn't know, and perhaps it didn't matter. All she knew was that the memory of him had become a beacon of light in the otherwise suffocating darkness of her life at court. The great hall of Thornhaven Castle was an imposing space, designed to inspire awe and demonstrate the power of the crown. Massive stone pillars rose from the floor to support the vaulted ceiling high above, and the walls were adorned with the banners of noble houses that had sworn fealty to King Richard. A long table ran down the center of the hall, capable of seating dozens of guests, and at the far end sat the king's throne, an ornate chair carved from dark oak and inlaid with silver. The floor was covered with fresh rushes mixed with herbs to mask the smell of the castle, and several large hearths burned along the walls, filling the space with warmth and the comforting crackle of flames. When Isabel and Catherine entered, the hall was already filled with courtiers and nobles, all dressed in their finest garments. The men wore tunics of rich fabrics, layered over leather jerkins, and secured with wide belts, studded with metal. Many had long cloaks draped over their shoulders, fastened with elaborate brooches that denoted their rank and allegiance. The women were no less impressive, their gowns flowing and elegant, made from wool and linen dyed in deep jewel tones, with fur trim and delicate embroidery that caught the light. The air buzzed with conversation, a low hum of voices punctuated by occasional laughter and the clinking of goblets. At the head of the table sat King Richard, a man of 50 years whose presence commanded respect and, in equal measure, fear. He was tall and broad-shouldered, though age had begun to soften his frame. His hair, once dark like Isabel's, was now streaked with silver, and his beard, neatly trimmed, framed a face marked by years of leadership and the burdens that came with it. He wore a tunic of midnight blue, embroidered with the royal crest in gold thread, and over it, a heavy cloak lined with ermine. A golden circlet rested on his brow, simple yet unmistakable in its significance. His eyes, a pale gray, swept the room with the practiced gaze of a man who missed nothing. Beside him sat Lord Pembroke, and Isabel felt her stomach tighten at the sight of him. He was perhaps 40, with thinning hair and a face that seemed perpetually twisted into an expression of disdain. His garments were expensive, almost ostentatiously so, with layers of embroidered silk and velvet that seemed excessive even by the standards of the court. His fingers, adorned with multiple rings, drummed impatiently on the table, and his eyes, small and calculating, fixed on Isabel the moment she entered the hall. "Ah, my daughter!" King Richard's voice boomed across the hall, silencing the conversations around them. "Come, join us. Lord Pembroke has traveled far to make your acquaintance." Isabel forced a smile onto her face and walked forward, her steps measured and graceful, despite the reluctance she felt. Catherine remained a respectful distance behind, blending into the background as was expected of a lady-in-waiting. When Isabel reached the head of the table, she curtsied deeply, first to her father and then to Lord Pembroke. "Your Majesty." "My lord," she said, her voice steady and composed. Lord Pembroke rose from his seat, his eyes raking over her in a way that made her skin crawl. "Your Highness, it is an honor to finally meet you. Your beauty is even more remarkable than the tales suggest." Isabel inclined her head politely, though inwardly she recoiled from his words. There was something predatory in the way he looked at her, as though she were not a person but a possession to be acquired. "You are too kind, my lord," she replied, her tone neutral. King Richard gestured to an empty chair beside him. "Sit, Isabel. We have much to discuss." As Isabel took her seat, she could feel the weight of every eye in the hall upon her. This was not just a meeting, it was a performance, a carefully orchestrated display meant to signal to the court that negotiations were underway. She kept her expression serene, her hands folded neatly in her lap, but inside, her mind raced. She thought of the blacksmith, of his warm smile and the strength in his arms. She thought of the freedom she had felt at the festival, the fleeting taste of a life unburdened by expectation, and she wondered if she would ever know such freedom again. The conversation at the high table droned on, a tedious exchange of pleasantries and veiled negotiations that made Isabel's head ache. Lord Pembroke spoke at length about his estates in the north, detailing his wealth and influence with a self-importance that bordered on nauseating. He described his castle, perched on a cliff overlooking the sea, as though it were the greatest fortress in all of England, and boasted of his troops, trained and loyal, ready to defend the crown at a moment's notice. King Richard listened with apparent interest, nodding at appropriate intervals and occasionally interjecting with questions that encouraged the lord to elaborate further. Isabel said little, offering only the minimal responses required of her. She smiled when expected, laughed politely at Lord Pembroke's attempts at humor, and maintained the perfect facade of an obedient daughter. But beneath the surface her mind was elsewhere, replaying that afternoon at the festival over and over again, clinging to the memory like a drowning person clinging to driftwood. As the meal progressed, servants brought forth platters of roasted venison, fresh bread still warm from the ovens, wheels of cheese, and bowls of stewed vegetables seasoned with herbs. Wine flowed freely, poured from ceramic jugs into silver goblets that gleamed in the firelight. The nobles ate with enthusiasm, their conversations growing louder and more animated as the wine loosened their tongues. But Isabel barely touched her food, pushing pieces of meat around her plate with her knife. Her appetite vanished. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, King Richard rose from his seat, signaling the end of the formal dinner. The hall gradually emptied as courtiers and nobles made their way to their chambers or gathered in smaller groups to continue their discussions. Lord Pembroke lingered, clearly hoping for a private moment with the princess, but King Richard intercepted him smoothly, guiding him toward a group of advisors who wished to discuss matters of taxation and trade routes. Isabel seized the opportunity to slip away, moving quickly through the corridors with Catherine close behind. Once they were safely away from the great hall, Isabel exhaled deeply, her shoulders sagging with relief. "That was unbearable," she said, her voice thick with frustration. "The way he looked at me, as though I were a horse he was considering purchasing. I felt like an object, not a person." Catherine placed a comforting hand on Isabel's arm. "I know, my lady, but you handled yourself with grace and dignity, as you always do. Your father seemed pleased." "My father is always pleased when I behave as he wishes," Isabel replied bitterly. "But what of my wishes, Catherine? Do they count for nothing?" Before Catherine could respond, a young page came running up the corridor, his face flushed with exertion. He bowed quickly, his breath coming in short gasps. "Your Highness," he panted, "a message has arrived for you, from the village." Isabel's heart skipped a beat. Messages from the villages were rare, and even rarer were messages addressed directly to her. She took the sealed parchment from the page's outstretched hand, noting the simple wax seal that bore no crest or identifying mark. Her fingers trembled slightly as she broke the seal and unfolded the letter. The handwriting was crude, the letters formed by someone unaccustomed to writing, but the message was clear enough. "Your Highness, if you wish to know more about the blacksmith who captured your attention at the festival, come to the old mill by the river at sunset tomorrow. Come alone and tell no one. A friend who wishes you well." Isabel read the message 3 times, her mind racing with possibilities and dangers. Who had sent this? How did they know about her interest in the blacksmith? And most importantly, could she trust them? The whole thing reeked of a trap, yet the opportunity to learn more about the man who had occupied her thoughts for months was almost irresistible. Catherine, reading the expression on Isabel's face, stepped closer. "What does it say, my lady?" Isabel hesitated, then handed the letter to Catherine, who read it quickly, her eyes widening with alarm. "You cannot seriously be considering this. Catherine said urgently, keeping her voice low. "This could be a plot to harm you, or worse, to compromise you. If anyone were to discover that you met with a stranger in secret, your reputation would be destroyed. I know the risks," Isabel said quietly, taking the letter back and folding it carefully. "But I also know that I cannot continue living this way, trapped in a gilded cage, watching my life be dictated by others. This may be my only chance to understand what I felt that day, to know if it was real or merely a foolish fantasy." "Then let me come with you," Catherine pleaded. "At least that way you will not be entirely alone." Isabel considered this for a moment, then shook her head. "The letter says to come alone. If I bring you, whoever sent this may not reveal themselves. But I promise you, Catherine, I will be careful. I will take a knife with me, and I will stay alert. If anything seems amiss, I will leave immediately." Catherine looked as though she wanted to argue further, but she knew from long experience that once Isabel had made up her mind, there was little point in trying to dissuade her. Instead, she simply nodded, her expression troubled. "Very well, my lady, but please, I beg you, do not let your heart lead you into danger." The following day passed with agonizing slowness. Isabel went through the motions of her daily routine, attending morning prayers in the castle chapel, sitting through a lesson with the court tutor on matters of history and statecraft, and enduring another excruciating meal with Lord Pembroke, who seemed even more determined to win her favor. Throughout it all, her mind was focused on the approaching sunset and the meeting that awaited her. As the afternoon light began to fade, casting long shadows across the castle grounds, Isabel made her preparations. She changed out of her elaborate gown and into a simpler dress of dark green wool, one that would not draw attention. Over this, she threw a hooded cloak of brown fabric, practical and unassuming. She strapped a small dagger to her thigh, hidden beneath the folds of her skirt, and checked to ensure that the blade was sharp. Then, with a final glance at Catherine, who watched from the doorway with worry etched across her face, Isabel slipped out of her chamber and made her way toward the stables. The castle was built on a hill overlooking the surrounding countryside, and the stables were located on the lower level near the main gate. Isabel moved quickly and quietly, keeping to the shadows and avoiding the main corridors where guards and servants were likely to be. She had explored the castle thoroughly over the years and knew every hidden passage and little-used stairway. It took her less than 10 minutes to reach the stables without being seen. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of hay and horses. The stablemaster was nowhere to be seen, likely enjoying his evening meal in the kitchens. Isabel approached a gentle mare named Stella, a horse she had ridden many times before. The animal nickered softly in recognition, and Isabel stroked her muzzle, murmuring soothing words as she quickly saddled her. Leading Stella out through a side door, Isabel mounted swiftly and urged the horse into a trot, heading down the path that led away from the castle and toward the river. The evening air was cool and crisp, carrying with it the scent of autumn leaves and distant wood smoke. The sky above was painted in shades of orange and pink as the sun dipped toward the horizon, and the first stars were beginning to appear. The old mill was located about 2 miles from the castle, nestled in a bend of the river where the water ran swift and deep. It had been abandoned for years, its wooden wheel broken and still, its walls covered in moss and ivy. The surrounding area was dense with trees, their branches creating a canopy that blocked out much of the remaining light. As Isabel approached, she felt a shiver of apprehension run down her spine. The place seemed almost eerie in the fading light, silent except for the rush of the river and the occasional call of a bird settling in for the night. She dismounted and tied Stella to a low-hanging branch, then made her way cautiously toward the mill. Her hand moved instinctively to the dagger at her thigh, ready to draw it if necessary. The door to the mill hung crooked on its hinges, and she pushed it open slowly, wincing at the creak of old wood. Inside, the mill was dark and musty, the air heavy with the smell of damp and decay. Shafts of fading sunlight filtered through gaps in the roof, illuminating dust motes that danced in the beams. The floor was littered with broken planks and debris, and in the center of the room stood the remains of the great millstone, cracked and covered in moss. "You came." The voice came from the shadows near the far wall, and Isabel spun around, her heart pounding. A figure stepped forward into the light, and she found herself staring at a woman of perhaps 30 years, dressed in the simple garb of a peasant. Her face was weathered and lined, but her eyes were sharp and intelligent, and there was a kindness in them that immediately put Isabel somewhat at ease. "Who are you?" Isabel demanded, her voice steady despite her nerves. "And how did you know about me?" The woman smiled faintly. "My name is Margaret, Your Highness. I am a healer in the village of Redbrook, and I have lived there all my life. I saw you at the festival, watching Thomas at his work. It was not difficult to recognize you, even with your veil. There is something about the way royalty carries themselves that sets them apart." "Thomas," Isabel repeated, the name sending a thrill through her. "The blacksmith. That is his name?" "Yes," Margaret confirmed, stepping closer. "Thomas Brennan. He is a good man, Your Highness. Perhaps the best I have ever known. Strong, honest, and kind. He works harder than any two men combined, and he uses what little he earns to help those in the village who have less than he does. He takes no wife, keeps no mistress, and lives a simple, honorable life." Isabel's heart swelled at these words, but she forced herself to remain cautious. "Why are you telling me this? What do you want?" Margaret's expression grew serious. "Because I have seen the way the nobility treats people like us, Your Highness. We are nothing to them, less than the horses they ride or the hounds they hunt with. But you looked at Thomas differently. There was something in your eyes that day, something that told me you saw him not as a peasant, but as a man. And I thought, perhaps, if you truly care for him, you should know the danger he is in." Isabel felt a chill run through her. "Danger? What do you mean?" "Lord Pembroke's men have been asking questions in the village," Margaret said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "They want to know who caught your attention at the festival. They have been threatening people, offering coin for information. It is only a matter of time before someone tells them about Thomas. And when they do, he will be arrested, or worse. Lord Pembroke will not tolerate any threat to his claim on you, even an imagined one." Isabel's blood ran cold. She had known her interest in Thomas was dangerous, but she had not considered that it might put him at risk. The thought of him being harmed because of her was unbearable. "I never spoke to him," Isabel said desperately. "We exchanged only a glance. Surely that is not enough to condemn him." "In the eyes of a jealous lord it is more than enough," Margaret replied grimly. "You must understand, Your Highness, men like Lord Pembroke do not forgive perceived slights. He will crush anyone he sees as a rival, no matter how innocent they may be." Isabel's mind raced. She had to do something, but what? She could not simply go to her father and confess her feelings for a blacksmith. That would only hasten Thomas's doom and destroy any hope she had of avoiding marriage to Lord Pembroke. But neither could she stand by and do nothing while an innocent man suffered because of her. "What can I do?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Margaret studied her for a long moment, as though weighing her words carefully. "There is one thing, Your Highness, though it is dangerous and may cost you dearly. You could warn Thomas yourself. Tell him to leave the village, to go somewhere Lord Pembroke's men cannot find him. It is not much, but it might save his life." "Where would he go?" Isabel asked. "And how can I possibly approach him without drawing even more attention?" "Thomas works late at the forge most evenings," Margaret said. "If you were to come to the village after dark, dressed as I am now, you could speak with him without being recognized. As for where he might go, there are places in the forest, old hunting lodges and abandoned cottages, where a man could hide for a time. But you must move quickly, Your Highness. Lord Pembroke's men grow more insistent with each passing day." Isabel stood in silence, the weight of the decision pressing down on her. Everything she had been taught, everything she had been raised to believe, told her that this was madness. A princess did not involve herself in the affairs of commoners, did not risk her reputation and safety for a man she barely knew. And yet the thought of Thomas being harmed, of his life being destroyed because she had dared to look at him with interest, was something she could not bear. "I will do it," she said finally, her voice firm with resolve. "Tell me when and where, and I will be there." Margaret nodded, a flicker of approval crossing her face. "Tomorrow night, after the church bells ring 9 times, come to the forge on the east side of the village. I will make certain Thomas is there, and that you will have a moment alone with him. But you must be careful, Your Highness. If you are caught, the consequences will be severe for both of you." "I understand," Isabel said. "And Margaret, thank you. Thank you for caring enough to warn me." Margaret inclined her head respectfully. "It is not just you I do this for, Your Highness, but for Thomas as well. He deserves better than to be a pawn in the games of the powerful. Now go, before someone notices your absence." Isabel turned and hurried back to where Stella waited, her mind a whirlwind of emotions. Fear, excitement, determination, and a deep, aching tenderness for a man she had never even spoken to. As she rode back toward the castle, the last light of the sun fading behind her, she knew that her life had just taken a turn from which there would be no going back. When she reached her chamber, Catherine was waiting, her face pale with worry. Isabel quickly recounted what had happened, and Catherine listened in stunned silence. "You are going to meet him," Catherine said when Isabel had finished. It was not a question, but a statement of fact. "I have to," Isabel replied simply. "I cannot let him suffer because of me." Catherine closed her eyes and took a deep breath, then opened them again, her expression resolute. "Then I am coming with you, not to the forge itself, but I will wait nearby. If something goes wrong, you will need someone to help you." Isabel wanted to argue, but she saw the determination in Catherine's eyes and knew it would be futile. Instead, she simply nodded, grateful beyond words for her friend's loyalty. "Thank you, Catherine. I do not know what I would do without you." The two women embraced, and in that moment, Isabel felt a spark of hope kindle in her chest. The path ahead was fraught with danger, but for the first time in her life, she was choosing it for herself, and whatever the cost, she would see it through to the end. The following day dragged on with unbearable slowness, each hour feeling like an eternity as Isabel waited for nightfall. She went through her daily obligations with mechanical precision, her mind constantly elsewhere, replaying Margaret's words and imagining what she would say to Thomas when they finally met. The very thought of speaking to him made her heart race with a mixture of anticipation and terror. What if he did not remember her? What if he thought her foolish for coming? Worse still, what if he resented her for bringing danger into his life? The morning began with prayers in the chapel, a cold stone chamber lit by dozens of candles that flickered and danced in the drafts that seeped through the ancient walls. Isabel knelt on the hard wooden pew, her hands clasped before her, but the words of the priest washed over her without meaning. She should have been praying for guidance, for strength to fulfill her duties as a princess, but instead, her thoughts were consumed by a pair of storm-gray eyes and a smile that had lingered in her memory for months. After prayers came breakfast in the private solar, a smaller, more intimate dining room reserved for the royal family. King Richard was already seated when Isabel arrived, breaking his fast with bread, cheese, and cold meat from the previous night's feast. Her younger brothers, Prince Henry and Prince Robert, were there as well, the former 14 years old and already showing signs of the warrior he would become, the latter only 11 and still more interested in books than swords. "Good morning, daughter," King Richard said without looking up from the document he was reading, a piece of parchment covered in dense script that appeared to be some kind of legal agreement. "Lord Pembroke has submitted his formal proposal for your hand. The terms are quite generous. We will discuss them this afternoon." Isabel's stomach clenched, but she kept her expression neutral as she took her seat. "Yes, father. He is a good match," the king continued, finally setting the document aside and looking at her directly. "Wealthy, powerful, and loyal to the crown. The marriage would secure the northern territories and strengthen our position against potential threats from Scotland. You should be pleased." "Should be." The words echoed in Isabel's mind with bitter irony. She should be pleased. She should be grateful. She should be obedient. But all she felt was a deep, gnawing sense of despair at the thought of spending the rest of her life shackled to a man she despised. "I am honored by Lord Pembroke's interest," Isabel said carefully, choosing each word with precision. "But might I ask if there is any urgency to this matter? I am only 20, father." "Surely there is time to consider all options before making such an important decision." King Richard's eyes narrowed slightly, a warning sign that Isabel recognized all too well. "Time is a luxury we do not have, Isabel. The political situation grows more volatile with each passing month. The northern lords grow restless, and there are whispers of dissent among the lower nobility. An alliance with House Pembroke would silence many of those whispers and demonstrate strength." "I had hoped you would understand your duty." "I do understand my duty, father," Isabel replied, keeping her voice respectful but firm. "I only ask for a little more time to prepare myself for such a significant change." The king studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he nodded curtly. Very well. I will give you 1 month to reconcile yourself to the match. But after that, the wedding will proceed whether you are ready or not. Do I make myself clear? Perfectly clear, Father. Thank you. The rest of the meal passed in uncomfortable silence, broken only by Prince Henry's enthusiastic description of a hunting trip he hoped to take in the coming weeks. Isabel barely heard him, her mind already turning to the evening ahead and the risks she was about to take. After breakfast, she retreated to her chamber, where Catherine was waiting with a bundle of clothing. The lady-in-waiting had clearly been busy, for she had assembled a complete peasant disguise, from the rough-spun wool dress to the simple leather shoes and hooded cloak that would help Isabel blend in with the common folk. I borrowed these from one of the kitchen maids, Catherine explained as she laid the garments out on the bed. She is about your size, and she owed me a favor. The dress is plain enough that no one will look twice at you, and the cloak will hide your face. Isabel ran her fingers over the coarse fabric, so different from the fine materials she was accustomed to wearing. There was something liberating about it, something that spoke of freedom and possibility. She looked up at Catherine, her eyes shining with gratitude. You are a true friend, Catherine. I will never forget this. Just promise me you will be careful, Catherine said, her voice thick with emotion. If anything were to happen to you, I would never forgive myself. I promise, Isabel said, taking her friend's hands in her own. We will both be careful, and with luck, this will all be over by midnight. The hours crawled by with agonizing slowness. Isabel forced herself to attend her lessons, to sit through another tedious discussion of diplomatic protocol and the proper forms of address for foreign dignitaries. She endured a meeting with the royal seamstress, who measured her for new gowns that would be appropriate for a future bride of Lord Pembroke. Each moment felt like torture, a countdown to an event that filled her with equal parts excitement and dread. Finally, as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant shades of crimson and gold, Isabel made her move. She claimed to be suffering from a headache, a common enough complaint that would not raise suspicion, and retired to her chamber early. Catherine helped her change into the peasant clothing, braiding her long chestnut hair and tucking it beneath a simple linen cap that completely concealed its length and color. When Isabel looked at herself in the polished silver mirror that hung on the wall, she barely recognized the woman staring back at her. Gone was the elegant princess in her fine gowns and jewels. In her place stood a common village girl, unremarkable and easily overlooked. It was perfect. They waited until full darkness had fallen, until the castle had settled into its evening routine and the guards had completed their rounds. Then, moving with the silence of shadows, Isabel and Catherine made their way down the servants' staircase, a narrow, winding passage that led directly to the kitchens. The cook and her assistants had long since retired for the night, and the vast room was empty save for the dying embers in the great hearth. They slipped out through the kitchen door and made their way across the castle grounds, keeping close to the walls and avoiding the pools of torchlight that marked the positions of the sentries. Isabel's heart pounded so loudly in her chest that she was certain someone would hear it, but they reached the stables without incident. This time they took 2 horses, both dark-colored animals that would be difficult to see in the darkness. Isabel mounted quickly, her hands trembling slightly as she gathered the reins. Catherine swung up onto her own horse with practiced ease, and together they rode out through a little used gate on the eastern side of the castle grounds, one that was guarded by a single elderly soldier who was known for his fondness for ale and his tendency to doze at his post. The ride to Redbrook took nearly an hour, following narrow forest paths that Isabel had explored during her rare excursions beyond the castle walls. The night was cool and clear, with a half-moon providing just enough light to see by. The forest around them was alive with nocturnal sounds, the hoot of owls, the rustle of small animals in the undergrowth, and the distant howl of a wolf that sent shivers down Isabel's spine. As they approached the village, Catherine pulled her horse to a stop and turned to Isabel. "I will wait here," she said quietly. "The forge is just beyond those houses, on the eastern edge of the village, as Margaret said. If you are not back within an hour, I am coming to find you." Isabel nodded, her throat suddenly too tight to speak. She dismounted and handed her reins to Catherine, then pulled the hood of her cloak low over her face and started walking toward the village. Redbrook was small, no more than 30 or 40 cottages clustered around a central square where the market was held. Most of the buildings were dark, their occupants already asleep, but here and there candlelight flickered behind shuttered windows. The streets were deserted, and Isabel's footsteps echoed softly on the packed earth as she made her way through the village. The forge was exactly where Margaret had said it would be, a sturdy stone building with a thatched roof and a large open doorway that glowed with the orange light of the fire within. As Isabel approached, she could hear the rhythmic clang of hammer on anvil, that same sound that had first captured her attention at the festival. Her heart began to race, and she had to force herself to keep walking, to not turn and flee back to the safety of the forest. She paused at the doorway, her hand resting on the rough wooden frame, and looked inside. The interior of the forge was hot and filled with smoke, the air shimmering above the glowing coals of the fire. Tools hung on the walls, hammers and tongs and files, all well used and carefully maintained. And there, standing at the anvil with his back to her, was Thomas. He was even more impressive than she remembered. His broad shoulders strained against the fabric of his tunic, which was damp with sweat despite the cool evening air. His arms, bare to the elbows, were corded with muscle that flexed and moved with each strike of the hammer. His dark hair was tied back with a leather thong, revealing the strong line of his jaw and the concentration on his face as he worked. There was something almost hypnotic about watching him, about the way he moved with such confidence and purpose. Isabel stood there for what felt like an eternity, unable to find her voice, simply drinking in the sight of him. And then, as if sensing her presence, Thomas paused in his work and turned around. Their eyes met, and for a moment the world seemed to stop. Recognition flickered across Thomas's face, followed quickly by confusion and then concern. He set down his hammer and wiped his hands on a rag, then took a step toward her. "Can I help you, miss?" he asked, his voice deep and warm, with the accent of the common folk that was so different from the cultured tones of the court. "Are you in need of repairs?" Isabel pulled back her hood, revealing her face, and watched as Thomas's eyes widened in shock. He took a step back, his expression transforming from polite curiosity to something approaching fear. "Your Highness," he breathed, and immediately dropped to one knee, his head bowed. "Forgive me. I did not recognize you. I meant no disrespect." "Please stand," Isabel said quickly, her voice urgent. "I am not here as a princess tonight. I am here as someone who needs your help, and who wishes to help you in return." Thomas rose slowly to his feet, his eyes never leaving her face. He was taller than she had realized, perhaps a full head taller than she was, and up close she could see the fine details of his features, the small scar above his left eyebrow, the flecks of gold in his gray eyes, the way his lips parted slightly as he struggled to understand what was happening. "I do not understand, Your Highness," he said carefully. "What could I possibly do to help you? And why would you risk coming here?" Isabel took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "Because you are in danger, Thomas Brennan. There are men looking for you, men who serve a lord who sees you as a threat, and I am the reason for that danger. I looked at you at the festival, and that simple act may have condemned you. I could not live with myself if I did nothing to warn you." Thomas's expression shifted from confusion to disbelief. "You came all this way, risked discovery just to warn me? But Your Highness, I am no one. I am a blacksmith, a peasant." "Why would anyone care that you looked at me?" "Because I am to be married," Isabel said, the words tasting like ash in her mouth, "to a lord who is jealous and cruel, who will not tolerate even the idea of competition. His men have been asking questions in the village, looking for anyone who might have caught my attention. It is only a matter of time before they learn about you." Thomas ran a hand through his hair, his expression troubled. "Then what would you have me do? Run? Abandon my home? My work? Everything I have built here?" "If it means saving your life, yes," Isabel said, stepping closer to him, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his skin, smell the forge smoke and sweat that clung to him. "There are places you could go, places where Lord Pembroke's reach does not extend. You could start over, build a new life somewhere safe." Thomas looked down at her, and in his eyes she saw not fear or gratitude, but something else entirely, something that made her breath catch in her throat. "And what of you, Your Highness?" he asked softly. "What happens to you when you return to your castle and marry this cruel lord? Who will save you?" The question hit Isabel like a physical blow, and she felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. No one had ever asked her that before. No one had ever cared what happened to her beyond how it might affect the kingdom or the political alliances of the crown. "I will survive," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I will do my duty, as I have always done, but at least I will know that you are safe, and that will be enough." Thomas reached out, and for a moment Isabel thought he was going to touch her face, but he stopped himself, his hand falling back to his side. "You are the bravest person I have ever met, Your Highness, but I cannot run. This is my home. These are my people. If I leave, Lord Pembroke's men will simply turn their attention to someone else, perhaps my master or one of my friends. I will not save myself at the cost of others." "Then what will you do?" Isabel asked desperately. "You cannot simply wait for them to come for you." "I will face whatever comes with honor," Thomas said firmly. "And if the price of that honor is my life, then so be it. But I will not run like a coward." Isabel felt a surge of frustration and admiration in equal measure. This man, this beautiful, stubborn man, was willing to die rather than abandon his principles. It was both infuriating and impossibly noble. "There must be another way," she said, her mind racing. "Some way to protect you without forcing you to flee." Thomas smiled then, a sad, gentle smile that made Isabel's heart ache. "Perhaps there is, Your Highness. Perhaps if you were to speak to your father, to tell him the truth about Lord Pembroke and the kind of man he is, he might reconsider the marriage." "My father cares only for political advantage," Isabel said bitterly. "He would not listen to me, and even if he did, he would likely punish me for my disobedience. No, that path leads nowhere." They stood in silence for a long moment, the weight of their impossible situation pressing down on them both. And then, without thinking, without considering the consequences, Isabel reached out and took Thomas's hand in hers. His skin was rough and calloused from years of hard work, but his touch was gentle, and the warmth of it spread through her like fire. "I wish things were different," she whispered. "I wish I had been born someone else, anyone else, so that I could choose my own path, so that I could choose you." Thomas's fingers tightened around hers, and when he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "And I wish I were a lord or a prince, someone worthy of you. But we are who we are, Your Highness, and wishing will not change that." The moment stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words and impossible desires. Isabel's hand remained clasped in Thomas's, and neither seemed willing to break the connection. The forge fire crackled behind them, casting dancing shadows on the stone walls, and in that small circle of warmth and light, the rest of the world seemed to fade away. "I should go," Isabel said finally, though she made no move to leave. "Catherine is waiting for me, and if I am gone too long, someone might notice my absence." "Then go," Thomas said, but his fingers remained intertwined with hers. "Be safe, Your Highness, and know that whatever happens, I will never forget this night, or the incredible risk you took to warn me." Isabel looked up at him, memorizing every detail of his face, knowing that this might be the last time she would ever see him. And then, acting on an impulse she could not control, she rose onto her toes and pressed her lips to his cheek, a brief, chaste kiss that nonetheless sent a jolt of electricity through her entire body. "My name is Isabel," she whispered against his skin. "And when you think of me, please, think of me as that, not as a princess or a title, but simply as Isabel." She pulled away before he could respond, drawing her hood back over her head and hurrying out into the night. Her heart was pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest, and her cheeks burned with a mixture of embarrassment and exhilaration. Behind her she could feel Thomas watching, and she forced herself not to look back, knowing that if she did, she might never find the strength to leave. Catherine was waiting exactly where Isabel had left her, her face tight with worry. The moment she saw Isabel emerge from the shadows, she let out a breath of relief. "Thank the saints," Catherine said, dismounting and embracing her friend. "I was beginning to think something had gone wrong. Did you speak with him? Is he safe?" "I warned him," Isabel said, her voice trembling slightly as she climbed back onto her horse. "But he refuses to leave. He says he will not run, that he will face whatever comes with honor." Catherine's expression darkened. "Then he is a fool, brave perhaps, but a fool nonetheless. Lord Pembroke's men will show no mercy." "He is not a fool," Isabel said sharply, surprising even herself with the vehemence in her voice. "He is principled and loyal to his people. Those are qualities to be admired, not condemned." Catherine held up her hands in a placating gesture. "I meant no offense, my lady. I only worry for both of you. This situation grows more dangerous with each passing day." They rode back to the castle in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The moon had risen higher in the sky, bathing the forest in silvery light, and the air had grown colder, carrying with it the promise of winter. When they finally reached the castle walls, they dismounted and led the horses back to the stables, moving with the same caution they had employed earlier. Once safely back in her chamber, Isabel changed out of the peasant clothing and back into her nightgown, a simple linen shift that reached to her ankles. She dismissed Catherine, assuring her friend that she would be fine, and then sat down at her writing desk, lighting a single candle that cast a warm glow over the parchment before her. She needed to think, to plan, to find some way out of this impossible situation, but her mind kept returning to the forge, to the feel of Thomas's hand in hers, to the way his eyes had looked when she had told him her name. She picked up her quill and dipped it in ink, then began to write. Not a letter to be sent, but simply a way to organize her thoughts and feelings. "What is duty?" she wrote. "Is it the path we are told to follow, regardless of our own desires? Is it the sacrifice of personal happiness for the good of others? Or is there a higher duty, a duty to oneself, to live an authentic life and pursue what truly matters?" She paused, staring at the words, then continued, "I have been taught since childhood that my purpose is to serve the kingdom, to marry well and produce heirs, to be a symbol of stability and continuity. But what if that teaching is wrong? What if my purpose is something else entirely, something I have yet to discover?" The candle burned lower as she wrote, filling page after page with her thoughts and questions, her hopes and fears. She wrote about Thomas, about the way he made her feel alive in a way she had never experienced before. She wrote about Lord Pembroke, about the revulsion she felt at the thought of being bound to him for life. And she wrote about her father, about the love she bore him despite their disagreements, and the pain of knowing that her happiness meant so little to him compared to political expediency. Finally, as the first light of dawn began to creep through her window, Isabel set down her quill and leaned back in her chair, exhausted. She gathered the pages she had written and folded them carefully, then placed them in the wooden chest at the foot of her bed, beneath a layer of old gowns and blankets where no one would think to look. She climbed into bed and pulled the covers up to her chin, but sleep would not come. Her mind was too active, too full of possibilities and fears. She lay there watching the shadows retreat as daylight filled the room, and she made a decision. She could not simply accept her fate. She had to fight somehow for the life she wanted. And if that meant challenging her father, defying convention, and risking everything she had ever known, then so be it. The following days passed in a blur of tension and anxiety. King Richard summoned Isabel to his council chamber to discuss the terms of her marriage to Lord Pembroke, laying out the details of the arrangement with the detachment of a merchant negotiating a business transaction. The wedding would take place in 2 months' time, at the height of winter, with all the great houses of the realm invited to attend. It would be a spectacle of wealth and power, a demonstration of the crown's strength and stability. Isabel listened to it all with a mask of calm indifference, nodding at the appropriate moments and asking polite questions about the ceremony and the feast that would follow. But inside, her mind was working furiously, searching for any weakness in the plan, any opportunity to delay or prevent the marriage from taking place. Meanwhile, rumors began to circulate throughout the castle and the surrounding villages. Whispers of a secret romance between the princess and a mysterious stranger, tales of late-night rides and clandestine meetings. Isabel did not know how these stories had started, whether someone had seen her and Catherine leaving the castle that night, or whether Lord Pembroke's men had learned something and were deliberately spreading gossip to force the king's hand. Either way, the rumors were dangerous, and they put both Isabel and Thomas at even greater risk. Lord Pembroke himself seemed oblivious to the gossip, or perhaps he simply did not care. He continued to court Isabel with a persistence that bordered on obsession, showering her with gifts of jewelry and fine fabrics, composing terrible poetry in her honor, and monopolizing her time at every meal and social gathering. His attentions became suffocating, and Isabel found herself retreating more and more to her chamber, claiming illness or fatigue to avoid his company. It was during one of these self-imposed isolations that Catherine brought her news that made her blood run cold. She had been in the kitchens, gathering food for Isabel's evening meal, when she overheard 2 of Lord Pembroke's guards discussing their orders. They had been instructed to ride to Redbrook the following morning and bring back a blacksmith named Thomas Brennan for questioning. The charges were vague, something about disturbing the peace and spreading seditious rumors, but Catherine had no doubt about the real reason for the arrest. "They are going after him," Catherine said urgently, pacing back and forth across the chamber like a caged animal. "Tomorrow morning, at first light, we have to warn him, my lady. We have to give him a chance to escape." Isabel felt as though the floor had dropped out from beneath her. She had known this moment would come, but the reality of it was far more terrifying than she had imagined. If Thomas was arrested, he would be brought to the castle dungeons, where Lord Pembroke could do whatever he wished with him. The thought of him being tortured or executed because of her was unbearable. "I will go to him tonight," Isabel said, her voice steady despite the fear that gripped her heart. "I will convince him to leave, even if I have to beg him on my knees." "My lady, it is too dangerous," Catherine protested. "If you are caught this time, there will be no explaining it away. Your father will know the truth and the consequences will be catastrophic." "I do not care," Isabel said fiercely. "I will not let an innocent man die because I was too afraid to act. If I am to be married off to that monster, if I am to spend the rest of my life in a prison of silk and gold, then at least let me do this one good thing before my freedom is taken from me forever." Catherine looked at her friend for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Then I am coming with you. All the way this time. If we are to be caught, we will be caught together." They waited until the castle had settled into its nightly routine, then dressed once again in the peasant clothing and made their way to the stables. This time, they encountered a problem. The stable master was still awake, tending to a horse that had gone lame during the day. Isabel and Catherine hid in the shadows, watching as the man worked, willing him to finish and leave. But he seemed in no hurry, taking his time as he examined the horse's leg and applied a poultice to the swollen joint. Minutes stretched into hours, and Isabel felt panic rising in her chest. They were running out of time. If they did not leave soon, dawn would break before they could reach Redbrook, and Thomas would be arrested before they could warn him. Finally, unable to wait any longer, Isabel made a decision. She stepped out of the shadows and approached the stable master, keeping her hood low over her face. "Good evening," she said, pitching her voice lower than usual and adopting the accent of the common folk. "My sister and I need to borrow horses. Our mother is ill in the village, and we must reach her before morning." The stable master looked up, squinting at her in the dim light. He was an older man, with gray hair and a weathered face, and he seemed more irritated than suspicious at the interruption. "The horses belong to the king," he said gruffly. "I cannot let them out without permission from the guard captain." Isabel reached into the pouch at her waist and pulled out a small silver coin, one of the few she had managed to hide away over the years. She held it out to the stable master, her hand steady despite her racing heart. "Please," she said, "our mother is dying. We will have the horses back before dawn, and no one need know they were ever gone. This is all we have, but it is yours if you will help us." The stable master stared at the coin for a long moment, then sighed heavily and took it from her hand. "Very well, but if you are not back by dawn, I will report the theft, and you will both be arrested. Do you understand?" "We understand," Isabel said quickly. "Thank you, sir. You are very kind." Within minutes, they were mounted and riding hard toward the forest, their cloaks billowing behind them in the wind. The night was darker than it had been on their previous excursion, with thick clouds obscuring the moon and stars. They had to slow their pace, picking their way carefully along the narrow paths, trusting their horses to find the way. When they finally reached Redbrook, the village was completely dark and silent. Not a single candle burned in any window, and the only sound was the distant rush of the river and the occasional bark of a dog. They dismounted and tied their horses in the same spot as before, then made their way on foot toward the forge. To Isabel's surprise, the forge was dark as well, the fire banked and no sign of activity within. She felt a moment of panic, wondering if they were too late, if Thomas had already been taken. But then she noticed a faint light coming from a small cottage next to the forge, a building she had not paid attention to on her previous visit. She approached cautiously and knocked softly on the door. For a moment, there was no response, and then she heard movement from within, followed by the sound of a bolt being drawn back. The door opened a crack, and Thomas's face appeared, his expression wary until he recognized her. "Isabel," he breathed, and immediately pulled the door open wider. "What are you doing here?" It is not safe. You have to leave, Isabel said urgently, pushing past him into the cottage. Now, tonight, Lord Pembroke's men are coming for you in the morning. They plan to arrest you and bring you to the castle. The cottage was small and sparsely furnished with a single room that served as both living and sleeping space. A narrow bed stood against one wall, covered with a rough wool blanket. A table and 2 chairs occupied the center of the room, and a small hearth provided heat and light. It was humble, almost austere, but it was clean and well-maintained, a reflection of the man who lived there. Thomas closed the door and turned to face her, his expression grave. "How do you know this?" My lady-in-waiting overheard the guards talking. Isabel explained, her words tumbling out in a rush. "They have orders to bring you in for questioning, but we both know what that means. Lord Pembroke wants you out of the way, and he will not be satisfied until you are dead or broken. Please, Thomas, you have to believe me. You have to run while you still can." Thomas ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration and indecision. "And where would I go, Isabel? I have no money, no connections beyond this village. How far do you think I would get before they caught me?" Catherine, who had been standing by the door keeping watch, spoke up. "There is a monastery in the western hills, about 3 days' ride from here. The monks there offer sanctuary to those in need, and even Lord Pembroke would hesitate to violate that protection. If you could reach it, you would be safe, at least for a time." Thomas looked from Catherine to Isabel, his expression torn. "And what of my master? What of the people here who depend on me? If I leave, they will suffer. If you stay, you will die," Isabel said, her voice breaking. "Please, Thomas, I am begging you. I cannot bear the thought of you being harmed because of me. This is all my fault, and I will never forgive myself if something happens to you." Thomas took a step toward her, and in the flickering light of the hearth, she could see the conflict in his eyes, the war between his sense of duty and his instinct for self-preservation. And then, to her surprise, he reached out and cupped her face in his hands, his touch gentle despite the roughness of his calloused palms. "It is not your fault," he said softly. "You did nothing wrong. You looked at me. That is all. And in that moment, you gave me something I had never experienced before. You saw me, Isabel, not as a peasant or a blacksmith, but as a man, and that was a gift beyond price." Tears streamed down Isabel's cheeks, and she covered his hands with her own, pressing them against her face. "Then do not throw that gift away. Live, Thomas. Please, just live." For a long moment they stood there, locked in that intimate embrace, the rest of the world forgotten. And then Thomas leaned down and pressed his forehead against hers, his breath warm against her skin. "I will go," he whispered, "not because I am afraid, but because you asked me to. Because the thought of causing you pain is more unbearable to me than any danger I might face." Relief flooded through Isabel like a wave, followed immediately by a different kind of pain, the knowledge that Thomas would be leaving, that she might never see him again. She wanted to hold on to this moment forever, to freeze time and remain here in this simple cottage where titles and duty did not matter, where she could simply be Isabel, and he could simply be Thomas. But the world outside was already intruding, pulling them apart, even as they stood together. "When will you leave?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Before dawn," Thomas replied, pulling back slightly but not releasing her entirely. "I will gather what little I have and ride west toward the monastery. With luck, I will be miles away before Pembroke's men arrive." "You will need supplies," Catherine said practically, stepping away from the door. "Food, water, warm clothing for the journey, and money, if you have any." Thomas shook his head. "I have a little coin saved, but not much. Most of what I earn goes to help others in the village. I never thought I would need to flee for my life." Isabel's mind was already working, calculating what she could provide. She reached into the hidden pocket sewn into her cloak and pulled out a small leather purse, heavy with coins. It was her personal allowance, money set aside for small purchases and charitable donations, but she pressed it into Thomas's hands without hesitation. "Take this," she said firmly. "It should be enough to see you safely to the monastery and keep you fed for several weeks after. And do not argue with me about it. Please." Thomas stared at the purse in his hands, his expression conflicted. "Isabel, I cannot take this. It is too much." "You can, and you will," Isabel insisted, closing his fingers around the leather. Consider it payment for the peace of mind you will give me by staying alive. Now, what else do you need?" Catherine stepped forward, removing her own cloak and draping it over Thomas's shoulders. It was made of good wool, lined with rabbit fur, far warmer than the thin cloak hanging by the door. "Take this as well. The nights are growing colder, and you will need protection from the elements." Thomas looked between the two women, and Isabel saw his eyes grow bright with unshed tears. "I do not deserve such kindness from either of you." "Kindness has nothing to do with what one deserves," Catherine said gently. "It is simply what good people do for one another. Now we should help you pack. Time is short." The three of them worked quickly and efficiently, gathering Thomas's meager possessions. A change of clothes, a water skin, some dried meat and bread from his larder, a whetstone for sharpening tools, and a small knife that could serve both as a utensil and a weapon if needed. Isabel insisted he take a wool blanket from the bed, over his protests that he would manage without it. As they worked, Thomas spoke quietly about his life, his voice tinged with sadness at leaving everything behind. He had been apprenticed to the village blacksmith at the age of 12 after his father, a farmer, had died from a fever. His mother had passed 2 years later, leaving him alone in the world. The blacksmith, Master Robert, had been kind to him, teaching him the trade and treating him like the son he had never had. When the old man died 3 years ago, Thomas had inherited the forge and the small cottage beside it. "Master Robert always said I had a gift for the work," Thomas said as he rolled up the blanket and tied it with cord. "He said I could make metal sing if I tried hard enough." I loved working with him, learning the craft, seeing raw iron transformed into something useful and beautiful. This forge is all I have of him, all I have of my family, and now I must leave it behind. Isabel felt her heart break for him, for the loss he was experiencing, for the life he was being forced to abandon. "You will come back," she said with a certainty she did not feel. "When this is over, when it is safe, you will return and reclaim what is yours. I promise you." Thomas smiled sadly. "You cannot promise that, Isabel. You do not know what the future holds any more than I do. But I appreciate the sentiment." Within an hour, everything was packed and ready. Thomas changed into his warmest clothes, layering tunics and breeches, and secured Catherine's cloak around his shoulders with a brooch he had made himself, a simple piece of worked iron in the shape of a horse. He slung his pack over his shoulder and took one last look around the cottage, his expression filled with such profound sorrow that Isabel had to look away. "I need to go to the forge one more time," he said quietly, "to bank the fire properly and secure the tools. If someone else takes over while I am gone, I do not want them to think I left in haste or carelessness." They walked together to the forge, a small procession in the darkness. Thomas moved through the space with practiced ease, checking that the fire was properly damped, hanging tools in their designated places, and sweeping the floor clear of metal shavings. Isabel watched him work, committing every movement to memory, knowing that these might be her last moments with him. When he was finished, Thomas turned to face her, and the expression on his face nearly undid her completely. There was so much he wanted to say. She could see it in his eyes, but the words seemed to catch in his throat. Instead, he reached out and took her hand, raising it to his lips and pressing a kiss to her knuckles, a gesture both courtly and deeply personal. "Thank you," he said simply, "for everything, for seeing me, for caring about my fate, for risking yourself to save me. I will carry the memory of you with me always, Isabel. No matter where I go or what becomes of me, I will never forget the princess who defied her world to protect a simple blacksmith." Isabel could not speak past the lump in her throat, so she simply nodded, squeezing his hand tightly. And then, because she knew she would regret it forever if she did not, she stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him, pressing her face against his chest. For a moment, Thomas stood frozen, shocked by the intimacy of the gesture. But then his arms came around her, holding her close, and they stood there in the darkness of the forge, two souls finding comfort in each other amid the chaos of their circumstances. "I wish we had more time," Isabel whispered against the rough fabric of his tunic. "I wish I could know you properly, learn everything about you, hear all your stories and dreams. I wish we lived in a different world where such things were possible." "As do I," Thomas murmured into her hair. "But we must make do with the world we have, not the world we wish for. And perhaps somewhere in that world, there is a future where our paths cross again. I choose to believe that, Isabel. I choose to hope." Catherine cleared her throat softly from where she stood by the door, a gentle reminder that time was running out. Reluctantly, Isabel pulled away, though her fingers lingered on Thomas's arm for a moment longer. "Go," she said, forcing strength into her voice. "Go now, before I lose my courage and beg you to stay despite the danger. Ride hard and do not stop until you reach the monastery. And when you are safe, when you are settled, find a way to send word. Please, I need to know that you are alive and well." Thomas nodded, his jaw set with determination. "I will find a way. I swear it." He walked to where his horse was kept in a small stable behind the cottage, a sturdy brown mare that he had purchased from a traveling merchant the previous year. The animal nickered softly in recognition as he approached, and he took a moment to stroke her muzzle and murmur reassurances before saddling her with quick, efficient movements. Once mounted, Thomas looked down at Isabel one final time, and in that moment the moonlight broke through the clouds, illuminating his face with an ethereal glow. He raised his hand in farewell, and she raised hers in return, a silent acknowledgement of everything that had passed between them and everything that never could be. And then he was gone, the sound of hoofbeats fading into the distance until there was nothing left but silence and the ache in Isabel's chest that threatened to consume her entirely. Catherine placed a hand on Isabel's shoulder, her touch gentle and grounding. "We should go as well, my lady. Dawn will break soon, and we must return before we are missed." Isabel nodded numbly, allowing herself to be led back to where their horses waited. The ride back to the castle passed in a blur, her mind occupied entirely with thoughts of Thomas, wondering how far he had traveled, whether he was safe, whether she would ever see him again. By the time they reached the castle walls, the eastern sky was beginning to lighten with the first hints of dawn. They returned the horses to the stable, where the stablemaster was already up and working, his expression sour when he saw them. He said nothing, however, simply took the reins and led the animals back to their stalls, pocketing the silver coin Isabel had given him with a grunt that might have been acknowledgement or disapproval. Back in her chamber, Isabel finally allowed herself to break down. She collapsed onto her bed, burying her face in the pillows to muffle her sobs. Catherine sat beside her, stroking her hair and murmuring words of comfort, but nothing could ease the pain that gripped Isabel's heart. She had done the right thing, she knew that, but the cost of that righteousness was almost more than she could bear. She must have fallen asleep eventually, exhausted by emotion and lack of rest, because when she opened her eyes again, the sun was high in the sky and someone was pounding urgently on her door. Catherine, who had been dozing in a chair by the window, jerked awake and hurried to answer it. A young servant girl stood in the hallway, her face pale and frightened. "Lady Catherine, the king requests the princess's immediate presence in the great hall. Lord Pembroke is there as well, and he is in a terrible rage." Isabel sat up slowly, her heart sinking. She knew what this meant. Lord Pembroke's men had arrived in Redbrook to find Thomas gone, and now there would be consequences. She rose from the bed and allowed Catherine to help her dress in a gown appropriate for court, a deep blue creation embroidered with silver thread that seemed to weigh 1,000 pounds. "Whatever happens," Catherine whispered as she fastened the final clasp at Isabel's neck, "remember that you did nothing wrong. You saved an innocent man's life. That is something to be proud of, not ashamed of." Isabel nodded, drawing on reserves of strength she had not known she possessed. She straightened her shoulders, lifted her chin, and walked out of the chamber with the grace and dignity expected of a princess, even as her insides churned with dread. The great hall was packed when she arrived, filled with courtiers and nobles who had clearly been summoned to witness whatever scene was about to unfold. At the head of the room stood King Richard, his face dark with anger, and beside him stood Lord Pembroke, his expression twisted into something ugly and vindictive. "Ah, my daughter," King Richard said, his voice cold and formal. "How kind of you to join us. Lord Pembroke has just informed me of a most disturbing situation. It seems the blacksmith his men were sent to arrest has vanished, fled in the night like the coward he is. And there are witnesses who claim to have seen 2 women, dressed as peasants, visiting his forge last night shortly before his disappearance. Women who bore a striking resemblance to you and your lady-in-waiting." Isabel felt the blood drain from her face, but she forced herself to remain calm, to show no outward sign of guilt or fear. "I do not know what you are talking about, father. I was in my chamber all night, as Catherine can attest. Can she? Lord Pembroke interjected, his voice dripping with contempt. Because my men have testimony from a stable master who claims to have lent horses to 2 women matching your descriptions. Women who paid him handsomely for his silence, though apparently not handsomely enough. The stable master. Of course. Isabel should have known better than to trust him, should have realized that his loyalty would last only as long as someone else offered him a better price. She felt a flash of anger, not at the man, but at herself for being so naive. I am sure there is a reasonable explanation, she began, but her father cut her off with a sharp gesture. Enough. I have heard enough lies and evasions. Do you take me for a fool, Isabel? Do you think I do not see what has been happening under my own roof? You have developed an attachment to this peasant, this common laborer, and in doing so, you have disgraced yourself and this family. You have endangered a valuable political alliance and shown contempt for the obligations of your birth. I have done no such thing, Isabel said, her voice rising despite her best efforts to remain composed. I have committed no crime, father. I warned an innocent man that he was in danger, that is all. Is compassion now considered a sin? Compassion? Lord Pembroke spat the word like a curse. You call it compassion to consort with a peasant in the dead of night, to provide him with money and aid in his escape? You are either a fool or a liar, your highness, and I am not certain which is worse. Isabel turned to face him fully, her fear giving way to righteous anger. And you, my lord, are a bully and a tyrant who seeks to destroy anyone you perceive as a threat. That man did nothing wrong. He did not pursue me, did not even know who I was until I revealed myself. His only crime was existing, and you would have seen him dead for it. So yes, I helped him escape, and I would do it again, without hesitation. The hall erupted in shocked whispers and gasps. No one spoke to a lord of Pembroke's stature in such a manner, least of all a young woman, princess or not. But Isabel was past caring about propriety or consequence. She had held her tongue for too long, played the obedient daughter for too many years, and now, faced with the prospect of a lifetime shackled to a man she despised, something inside her had finally broken free. King Richard's face turned an alarming shade of red, and when he spoke, his voice shook with barely controlled rage. You will retract those words immediately and apologize to Lord Pembroke, or I swear by all that is holy, you will regret this defiance. I will not apologize for speaking the truth, Isabel said steadily, and I will not marry a man who would see an innocent person harmed to satisfy his own jealousy and pride. I refuse, father. I refuse this marriage. The silence that followed was absolute, so complete that Isabel could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. No one moved. No one breathed, as the full weight of what she had just said settled over the assembled court. And then King Richard spoke, his voice cold and final as a judge pronouncing sentence. Then you leave me no choice, daughter. Until such time as you come to your senses and remember your duty, you are confined to your chambers. You will speak to no one, see no one except the servants who bring your meals, and you will have ample time to reflect on the consequences of your disobedience. Guards, escort the princess to her room and see that she remains there. 2 guards stepped forward, their faces carefully neutral as they positioned themselves on either side of Isabel. She did not resist, did not give her father the satisfaction of seeing her struggle or plead. Instead, she held her head high and walked from the great hall with as much dignity as she could muster, acutely aware of every eye upon her, every whispered comment that followed in her wake. The walk back to her chamber felt endless, a parade of shame through corridors she had walked freely all her life. Servants pressed themselves against the walls as she passed, their expressions ranging from pity to curiosity to something that might have been admiration. Word would spread quickly through the castle, Isabel knew. By nightfall, every soul within these walls would know that the princess had defied her father and refused her arranged marriage. When they reached her chamber, one of the guards opened the door and stood aside, allowing her to enter. Catherine tried to follow, but the guard blocked her path with his spear. No one is to enter or leave without the king's explicit permission, he said gruffly. Those are our orders. But I am her lady-in-waiting, Catherine protested. Surely I am allowed to attend to her needs. Not anymore, the guard replied, unmoved by her appeal. The princess is to be isolated completely. Food and water will be brought by servants, but she is to have no visitors and no correspondence with anyone. Catherine's eyes met Isabel's through the doorway, filled with anguish and helplessness. Isabel gave her friend a small, sad smile, trying to convey reassurance she did not feel. "It will be all right, Catherine," she said softly. "Do not worry about me. I have faced worse than solitude." It was a lie, and they both knew it. But Catherine nodded anyway, blinking back tears. The door swung shut with a heavy thud, and Isabel heard the sound of a bolt being drawn, locking her in. She stood in the center of the room, suddenly feeling the full weight of her imprisonment settling over her like a physical thing. The chamber that had always been her sanctuary now felt like a cage. The stone walls, once comforting in their solidity, now seemed oppressive and confining. The window, her connection to the outside world, mocked her with its view of freedom she could no longer access. She walked to it slowly and pressed her palm against the cold glass, staring out at the kingdom that stretched beyond the castle walls. Somewhere out there, Thomas was riding toward the monastery, carrying with him her hope and her heart. She prayed he was safe, that he had not been caught, that Lord Pembroke's men had not somehow intercepted him on the road. The not knowing was its own special torment, worse in some ways than any physical punishment her father might have devised. The first day of her confinement passed with agonizing slowness. True to the king's word, no one came to see her except a young servant girl who brought her meals, leaving the trays just inside the door before hurrying away without making eye contact. Isabel tried to engage her in conversation, to ask for news from beyond her chamber, but the girl remained stubbornly silent, clearly terrified of disobeying the king's orders. Isabel spent the hours pacing the length of her room, her mind refusing to settle. She tried to read from the few books she kept in her chamber, but the words swam before her eyes without meaning. She attempted to write, to pour her thoughts and feelings onto parchment as she had done before, but her hand shook so badly that the ink splattered and the letters came out illegible. As night fell, she lay in her bed staring at the ceiling, watching shadows dance in the dim light of a single candle. Sleep eluded her, her thoughts spiraling between worry for Thomas, anger at her father, and a growing sense of dread about what would happen next. Would her father eventually break her will, force her to submit to the marriage through isolation and deprivation? Or would he find some other way to punish her defiance? The second day brought no change. The same silent servant delivered her meals. The same suffocating isolation pressed down on her. Isabel found herself talking aloud simply to hear a human voice, even if it was only her own. She recited poetry she had memorized as a child, sang songs her mother had taught her before she died, told stories to the empty air as though someone was listening. By the third day, she began to understand the true cruelty of solitary confinement. It was not just the physical isolation that wore on her, but the complete absence of human connection, of touch and conversation, and the simple acknowledgement of one's existence by another person. She caught herself staring at her own reflection in the mirror, desperate for some form of interaction, even if it was only with herself. It was on the fourth day that something changed. The servant who brought her morning meal was different, an older woman Isabel recognized from the kitchens. She set the tray down as usual, but as she turned to leave, she paused and glanced back at Isabel, her expression troubled. "Your Highness," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "There is talk in the village about what you did, helping that blacksmith escape. The common folk, they are saying you have a kind heart, that you are not like the other nobles who care nothing for their suffering." Isabel's heart leaped at this unexpected communication, and she moved quickly toward the woman. "Please, can you tell me anything about Thomas? About whether he made it safely away?" The woman glanced nervously at the door, clearly afraid of being caught. "I know nothing of the blacksmith himself, Your Highness, but I can tell you that Lord Pembroke is furious. He has sent men throughout the kingdom searching for him, offering rewards for information, and he has been pressuring your father to set a date for the wedding, to formalize the engagement before anything else can interfere." Before Isabel could ask more, the sound of footsteps in the corridor sent the woman scurrying toward the door. She slipped out quickly, leaving Isabel alone once more. But the brief exchange had given her something she desperately needed: hope. The people knew what she had done, and at least some of them approved. That knowledge kindled a small flame of defiance in her chest, a reminder that she was not entirely powerless, not entirely alone. Over the following days, the servant woman managed to slip Isabel small scraps of information during her brief visits. She learned that the castle was in turmoil, with factions forming among the nobles. Some supported King Richard's decision to confine his daughter, viewing her defiance as dangerous and worthy of punishment. Others, particularly the younger nobles and those who had no great love for Lord Pembroke, seemed to sympathize with Isabel's position, though none dared speak openly against the king. She learned too that Catherine had been questioned extensively about her role in Thomas's escape. The lady-in-waiting had admitted to accompanying Isabel, but claimed she had tried to dissuade the princess from her course of action and had only agreed to come along to ensure her safety. It was a clever defense, one that protected Catherine from the worst of the king's wrath while still maintaining a grain of truth. Catherine had been reassigned to serve another noble lady and was forbidden from approaching Isabel's chamber. But the most significant news came on the 7th day of her confinement. The servant woman arrived with Isabel's evening meal, her face flushed with excitement despite her obvious attempts to remain composed. "Your Highness," she whispered urgently as she set down the tray, "there is something you must know. The villages are in an uproar. Word has spread about your imprisonment, about how you are being punished for showing compassion to a commoner. The people are angry, Your Highness." Angry at the king, at Lord Pembroke, at the injustice of it all. Isabel felt her pulse quicken. "What do you mean, an uproar? What are they doing?" "They are gathering," the woman said, her eyes wide. "In Redbrook and the surrounding villages, farmers and craftsmen, merchants and laborers, even some of the minor gentry who hold no love for Lord Pembroke. They are talking of marching to the castle, of demanding your release. I have never seen anything like it, Your Highness. The common folk rising up for a noble? It is unheard of." Isabel's mind raced with the implications of this news. On one hand, the thought that people were willing to stand up for her filled her with profound gratitude and humility. On the other hand, she knew how dangerous such a situation could become. If armed peasants marched on the castle, her father would have no choice but to respond with force, and blood would be spilled. The very people she had tried to protect by helping Thomas would end up suffering because of her. "You must get word to them," Isabel said urgently, gripping the woman's arm. "Tell them not to march, not to risk themselves. I could not bear it if people were hurt because of me." The woman shook her head sadly. "I do not think they will listen, Your Highness. They have made up their minds. They believe you are being treated unjustly, and they mean to do something about it. The march is planned for 3 days from now, when the market day brings everyone together naturally. They will come peacefully, they say, but they will not leave until you are freed." After the woman left, Isabel sank into her chair, her mind whirling with conflicting emotions. Part of her was deeply moved by this show of support from people she had never met, people who owed her nothing but had chosen to stand with her anyway. But a larger part was terrified of what might happen when several hundred angry villagers confronted the might of the royal guard. She had to do something, had to find a way to prevent this confrontation before it turned violent. But what could she do? Locked in her chamber with no way to communicate with the outside world except through brief whispered exchanges with a sympathetic servant. The answer came to her in the middle of the night as she lay awake staring at the ceiling. If she could not prevent the march, perhaps she could use it to her advantage. If the people truly were willing to stand up for her, then perhaps her father would be forced to reconsider his position. A king's power came from the consent of the governed, after all. And if enough people withdrew that consent, even a monarch as powerful as King Richard would have to take notice. But she would need help, and there was only one person in a position to provide it. Margaret, the healer from Redbrook who had first warned her about Thomas. If Isabel could somehow get a message to her, perhaps Margaret could help shape the protest, keep it peaceful while still making its point effectively. The question was how to get that message out of the castle when she was forbidden all correspondence and her every move was watched. Isabel spent the entire next day pondering the problem, examining every angle, considering and discarding dozens of plans. It was not until the servant woman arrived with her evening meal that inspiration struck. "Can you read?" Isabel asked quietly as the woman set down the tray. The woman looked surprised by the question. "A little, Your Highness. My father was a clerk, and he taught me my letters before he died." "Why do you ask?" "Because I need to send a message to someone in Redbrook," Isabel said, moving quickly to her writing desk and pulling out a piece of parchment. "A woman named Margaret, a healer. Do you know her?" The servant nodded slowly, I know of her, Your Highness. She is well respected in the village, known for her wisdom and her healing skills. But how can I possibly deliver a message without being caught? You go to the village for supplies, do you not? Isabel asked, her pen already moving across the parchment. Kitchen staff must make regular trips to purchase food and goods from the markets. Yes, but we are always accompanied by guards, and they watch us closely. If I were caught with a letter from you, I would be arrested, possibly executed for treason. Isabel paused in her writing and looked up at the woman. I know I am asking much of you, and I have no right to put you at such risk. But please, you must understand, if this march happens as planned, people will die. My father will not hesitate to use force against what he perceives as a rebellion, and Lord Pembroke will encourage him to do so. This message could save lives, could help turn a dangerous situation into a peaceful resolution. I would not ask if there were any other way. The woman stood silent for a long moment, clearly wrestling with her fear and her conscience. Finally, she took a deep breath and nodded. Very well, Your Highness, I will do it. But the message must be small, something I can hide easily. And you must write it in terms that would seem innocent if discovered. Isabel nodded and bent back to her task, crafting the message with care. She wrote of herbs and remedies, of a sickness that could be cured with the right medicine and the right approach. But woven into the seemingly innocent words was a clear message. The protest must remain peaceful, must avoid any action that could be construed as violence or rebellion, and must focus solely on calling for Isabel's release and the right of all people to be treated with justice and compassion. When she finished, she folded the parchment into a tiny square no larger than her thumb, and sealed it with a drop of wax, pressing it closed without using her official seal. She handed it to the servant woman, who tucked it into the bodice of her dress where it would be hidden from view. Thank you, Isabel said, her voice thick with emotion. You are risking everything to help me, and I will never forget it. If there is ever anything I can do to repay you, you need only ask. The woman smiled sadly. Just see that those people do not die for their loyalty to you, Your Highness. That will be payment enough. After she left, Isabel returned to the window, looking out at the darkened landscape. Somewhere out there, Thomas was hiding in a monastery, safe but isolated. Somewhere out there, hundreds of people were preparing to march in her defense. And somewhere in the castle below her, her father and Lord Pembroke were plotting her future, with no regard for her wishes or her happiness. But for the first time since her confinement began, Isabel felt something other than despair. She felt a sense of purpose, a connection to something larger than herself. The common people saw her not as a princess to be displayed like a prize, but as a person worthy of defending. That knowledge gave her strength she had not known she possessed. Whatever came next, whatever trials and tribulations awaited, she would face them with her head held high and her conscience clear. She had chosen compassion over duty, love over obligation, and if that made her unfit to be a princess in her father's eyes, then perhaps it was time for a different kind of princess to emerge, one who served her people rather than ruling over them. The 3 days that followed were the longest of Isabel's life. Each hour stretched into an eternity as she waited for news, for some sign that her message had reached Margaret and that the protest could be managed safely. The servant woman came and went with her meals, but she said nothing about whether the letter had been delivered, maintaining her silence in case the guards were listening at the door. Isabel spent the time preparing herself mentally for whatever was to come. She knew that when the villagers arrived, her father would be forced to make a choice, either address their grievances or suppress them with force. King Richard was not a cruel man by nature, but he was proud and stubborn, and he valued order and tradition above almost everything else. The question was whether his love for his daughter would outweigh his anger at her defiance. On the morning of the 3rd day, Isabel woke to an unusual amount of activity in the castle. She could hear raised voices in the corridors, the sound of armor clanking as guards hurried past, and the general sense of urgency that suggested something significant was happening. She pressed her ear to the door, trying to make out what was being said, but the words were too muffled to understand clearly. It was not until mid-morning that the servant woman arrived, her face pale and her hands trembling as she set down the breakfast tray. The moment the door closed behind her, she turned to Isabel with wild eyes. "They are here, Your Highness," she whispered urgently. "Hundreds of them, perhaps more than 1,000. They gathered at dawn in the fields beyond the castle walls, and they are calling for you. The king has assembled the full guard, and tensions are running high." Lord Pembroke is demanding that your father order a charge to disperse the crowd, but so far the king has held back. Isabel felt her heart leap into her throat. Are they being peaceful? Has anyone been hurt? So far, yes, they remain peaceful, the woman confirmed. They carry no weapons, only farming tools and signs bearing messages of support for you. But your highness, the situation is volatile. All it would take is one hot-headed fool on either side to turn this into a bloodbath. Isabel moved to the window, straining to see the fields beyond the castle walls. But her chamber faced the wrong direction. She could see nothing of the gathering crowd, only the same view of forest and distant villages that she had been staring at for days. The frustration of being so close to the action yet completely removed from it was almost unbearable. I need to speak to them, Isabel said suddenly, turning back to the servant woman. If I could just address the crowd, explain to them that I appreciate their support, but do not want them to risk themselves. Perhaps we could diffuse this situation before it escalates. The woman shook her head sadly. The king has given strict orders that you are to remain confined. The guards outside your door have been doubled, and they have instructions to prevent anyone from entering or leaving, no matter what. Isabel clenched her fists in frustration, feeling utterly helpless. She had started this chain of events with her decision to help Thomas, and now innocent people were putting themselves in danger because of her. If violence erupted, their blood would be on her hands. For the next several hours, she could do nothing but wait and listen to the muffled sounds of activity throughout the castle. At one point, she heard what sounded like a great roar from outside, the collective voice of 1,000 people raised in unison, though she could not make out what they were saying. The sound sent chills down her spine, both thrilling and terrifying in its power. It was late afternoon when the door to her chamber suddenly burst open and King Richard strode in, his face flushed with anger and something that might have been fear. Behind him came Lord Pembroke, his expression twisted with rage, and 2 guards who took up positions on either side of the door. Do you see what your foolishness has wrought? King Richard demanded, gesturing toward the window as though she could see through the walls. There are over 1,500 people gathered beyond our walls, demanding your release. They refuse to leave, refuse to disperse, and their numbers grow with each passing hour as more arrive from distant villages. This is chaos, Isabel. This is rebellion, and it is entirely your fault. Isabel stood her ground, meeting her father's gaze steadily. It is not rebellion, father. It is people exercising their right to petition their king for justice. They are not armed, they have made no threats. They simply want to see that I am treated fairly. Fairly? Lord Pembroke interjected, his voice dripping with contempt. You conspired to help a criminal escape justice. You defied your king's commands, and you have brought shame upon your house. And yet these peasants dare to demand your release as though you were some innocent victim? The situation is intolerable. The only thing that is intolerable, Isabel shot back, is your jealousy and your cruelty. Thomas Brennan committed no crime. His only offense was existing in a way that threatened your pride. And now you seek to punish not just me, but an entire population of people whose only crime is caring about justice. King Richard held up a hand, silencing them both. Enough. This bickering serves no purpose. He turned to Isabel, and she saw in his eyes a weariness she had never noticed before, as though the weight of the crown had suddenly become visible. I am faced with an impossible choice, daughter. If I give in to the demands of this mob, I show weakness, and every malcontent in the kingdom will think they can bend the crown to their will through intimidation. But if I order my guards to disperse them by force, I risk starting a civil conflict that could tear this realm apart. Tell me, how did we come to this? For the first time since entering the room, Isabel heard not anger in her father's voice, but genuine confusion and pain. He was not just a king faced with a political crisis. He was a father trying to understand how his relationship with his daughter had deteriorated to this point. We came to this because you forgot that I am a person, not a piece on a game board to be moved at your convenience, Isabel said, her voice softer now but no less firm. You forgot that I have hopes and dreams and feelings of my own. You saw me only as a tool to secure political alliances, never once asking what I wanted or what would make me happy. And when I finally found the courage to stand up for myself, to act according to my own conscience, you locked me away like a prisoner. King Richard was silent for a long moment, and Isabel saw emotions flicker across his face, anger, hurt, shame, and finally something that looked like understanding. But before he could respond, Lord Pembroke stepped forward, his face contorted with fury. "This is sentimentality and weakness," he spat. "What the princess wants is irrelevant. She is a royal, born to duty and obligation. Her personal happiness is a luxury she does not have the right to demand. Your Majesty, I urge you to put an end to this farce immediately. Order your guards to clear the field, arrest the ringleaders, and announce that the wedding will proceed as planned. Any other course of action will be seen as capitulation." "And what of the cost?" King Richard asked, turning to face the Lord. "What of the lives that will be lost if I follow your counsel? These are my subjects, Pembroke, my people. I am sworn to protect them, not slaughter them for the crime of caring about my daughter. They are peasants," Lord Pembroke said dismissively, "expendable and easily replaced. But your authority as king is not. If you show weakness now, you will spend the rest of your reign fighting rebellions and challenges to your power. Sometimes hard decisions must be made for the greater good." Isabel felt rage boiling up inside her at his callous words. "Listen to yourself. You speak of people as though they were livestock, as though their lives have no value beyond their service to you. This is why I could never marry you, Pembroke. You have no heart, no compassion, no understanding of what it means to be human. You are a monster dressed in fine clothes." Lord Pembroke's hand moved to the hilt of his sword, and for a moment Isabel thought he might actually draw it. But King Richard stepped between them, his own hand raised in warning. "That is enough," the king said firmly. "Lord Pembroke, leave us. I wish to speak with my daughter privately." "Your Majesty, I must protest. I said leave us." King Richard's voice cracked like a whip, brooking no argument. Lord Pembroke's face turned an alarming shade of purple, but he bowed stiffly and stalked from the room, the guards following him out and closing the door behind them. Alone with her father for the first time since her confinement began, Isabel felt some of her anger drain away, replaced by a deep sadness. She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw not the imposing king she had always known, but a man growing old, burdened by responsibilities and difficult choices. "I never wanted this," King Richard said quietly, moving to the window and staring out at the kingdom beyond. "When your mother died giving birth to your youngest brother, I swore I would protect you, provide for you, ensure that you had a good life. Everything I have done, every decision I have made regarding your future, has been with that goal in mind. Can you understand that, Isabel? Can you see that I have never wished you harm? I know you love me in your own way, Father," Isabel replied, moving to stand beside him. "But you have loved me as a king loves a princess, not as a father loves a daughter. You have seen me as a responsibility to be managed, an asset to be deployed, rather than as a person with her own thoughts and feelings." King Richard closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, they were bright with unshed tears. "Your mother understood me in ways no one else ever has. She knew that being king meant making hard choices, sacrificing personal desires for the good of the realm. But she also knew how to be soft when softness was needed, how to temper justice with mercy. I have tried to be both king and father to you, but I fear I have failed at both." "You have not failed," Isabel said gently, placing her hand on his arm. "But it is not too late to choose a different path. Those people outside, they are not rebelling against you, Father. They are appealing to your better nature, to the compassion and wisdom they believe you possess. They want to believe that their king cares about them, that their voices matter. You have an opportunity here to show them that their faith is not misplaced." "And what would you have me do?" King Richard asked, turning to face her. "Release you from confinement? Call off the engagement to Lord Pembroke? Allow you to choose your own path, even if that path leads to a blacksmith's cottage?" Isabel took a deep breath, knowing that her next words would shape not just her own future, but the future of everyone gathered outside the castle walls. "I would have you remember that you are not just a king, but a father, and that your daughter, for all her faults and failings, has tried to do what she believes is right. I do not ask you to approve of my choices, only to respect that they are mine to make. As for Thomas Brennan, he is gone, fled to sanctuary where your writ does not run. There is no reason to continue pursuing him or to insist on a marriage to Lord Pembroke. That would make us all miserable." King Richard studied her face for a long moment, as though seeing her clearly for the first time in years. Finally, he nodded slowly. "You have grown into a remarkable woman, Isabel, strong-willed and stubborn, like your mother, but also compassionate and brave. Perhaps I have been too rigid in my thinking, too focused on tradition and political advantage to see what was right in front of me. He moved to the door and opened it, calling for the guards. When they appeared, he gave them orders that made Isabel's heart soar with hope. The princess is to be released from confinement immediately. Send word to the crowd that I will address them personally within the hour, and that the princess will accompany me. And find Lord Pembroke. Tell him I wish to speak with him about the dissolution of the engagement. The guards looked shocked but hurried to carry out their orders. King Richard turned back to Isabel, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he smiled at her, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. Come, daughter, let us go face your admirers together, and perhaps in doing so, we can begin to repair what has been broken between us. Isabel felt tears streaming down her face as she embraced her father, feeling the tension and anger of the past days melting away. It was not a complete victory, she knew. There would still be consequences to face, difficult conversations to have, and an uncertain future to navigate. But it was a beginning, a chance to forge a new path based on mutual respect rather than blind obedience. Together, father and daughter left the chamber and made their way through the castle toward the great courtyard where they would address the gathered crowd. As they walked, Isabel allowed herself, for the first time in days, to think about Thomas. She wondered if he had heard about the protest, if he knew that an entire kingdom had risen up in defense of the princess who had shown him kindness. She wondered if she would ever see him again, if their paths would cross once more, or if their brief encounter would remain nothing more than a beautiful memory. But whatever the future held, she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She had found her voice, and she would never allow anyone to silence it again. The great courtyard of Thornhaven Castle was typically a place of controlled activity, where guards trained and nobles arrived in their carriages for audiences with the king. But on this day, it had been transformed into something else entirely, a stage upon which the future of the kingdom would be decided. The massive iron gates that normally remained closed had been thrown open, allowing the assembled crowd a clear view of the raised platform where King Richard and Princess Isabel would speak. As Isabel walked beside her father through the corridors leading to the courtyard, she could hear the sound of the crowd, a low rumble of thousands of voices blending together into something that resembled the ocean. Her heart pounded in her chest, and despite her newfound resolve, she felt a tremor of fear. She had never addressed such a large gathering before, had never been the focus of so much attention and expectation. Catherine appeared suddenly from a side corridor, her face alight with hope and relief. She had clearly heard about Isabel's release and had come running. The two women embraced briefly, and Catherine whispered urgently in her ear, "The mood of the crowd is tense but hopeful, my lady. Margaret is there, near the front. She has been working to keep everyone calm and peaceful, but there are agitators present as well, people who want to turn this into something violent. You must choose your words carefully." Isabel nodded, grateful for the warning and for her friend's steadfast support. "Thank you, Catherine, for everything. I could not have survived these past days without knowing you were out here, thinking of me." As they reached the entrance to the courtyard, King Richard paused and turned to his daughter. "Are you ready for this? Once we step out there is no turning back. Whatever we say, whatever promises we make, will be binding. The people will hold us to our word." "I am ready," Isabel said, squaring her shoulders and lifting her chin. "I have been preparing for this my entire life, though I did not know it until now." They stepped out into the autumn sunlight together, and the roar of the crowd was instantaneous and deafening. Thousands of faces turned toward them, a sea of humanity stretching from the castle gates across the fields beyond. Farmers in their work clothes stood beside merchants in finer garb. Women with children in their arms stood next to elderly men leaning on walking sticks. And scattered throughout were members of the minor nobility, landholders and knights who had chosen to stand with the common folk rather than remain safe within their own estates. King Richard raised his hand for silence, and gradually the noise subsided until an expectant hush fell over the gathering. When he spoke, his voice carried across the courtyard with the authority of a man accustomed to command. "People of this realm," he began, "I stand before you today not merely as your king, but as a father who has learned a difficult lesson. My daughter, Princess Isabel, has been confined to her chambers for the past 10 days as punishment for defying my wishes and acting according to her own conscience. Many of you have gathered here today to protest that confinement, to demand her release and to call for justice. I have heard your voices, and I have listened to your concerns." He paused, letting his words sink in, and Isabel could see the tension in the crowd, the way people leaned forward, waiting to hear what would come next. "I am releasing my daughter from confinement," King Richard continued, and a cheer erupted from the crowd, so loud and sustained that he had to wait several minutes before he could continue. "Furthermore, I am dissolving the engagement between Princess Isabel and Lord Pembroke. It has become clear to me that this match, while politically advantageous, would bring happiness to neither party, and a marriage without mutual respect and affection is a prison by another name." The cheering intensified, and Isabel felt tears spring to her eyes. Her father was actually doing it, actually standing before his people and admitting that he had been wrong. It was a remarkable display of humility from a man who had spent his entire life believing that a king must never show weakness. But even as the crowd celebrated, Isabel noticed a commotion near the back of the gathering. A group of men, perhaps 20 or 30 strong, were pushing their way forward, their faces twisted with anger. They wore the colors of House Pembroke, and at their head was Lord Pembroke himself, mounted on a massive black stallion and flanked by armed guards. "This is an outrage," Lord Pembroke's voice cut through the celebration like a knife. "You cannot simply dissolve an engagement that has been formally announced and agreed upon by both parties. I have a contract, signed and sealed, that guarantees this marriage. To break it now is to dishonor not just me, but the entire system of noble agreements that holds this kingdom together." King Richard's expression hardened, and Isabel could see the struggle playing out on his face, the old habits of deference to powerful nobles warring with his newfound commitment to doing what was right. Before her father could respond, Isabel stepped forward, her voice ringing out clear and strong. "You speak of honor, Lord Pembroke, but you know nothing of it. Honor is not found in contracts and political arrangements. It is found in how we treat those who have no power to defend themselves, in the compassion we show to those who are vulnerable, in the courage to stand up for what is right, even when it costs us dearly. You sought to have an innocent man arrested and possibly killed simply because you feared he might be a rival for my affections. You have shown yourself to be petty, cruel, and unworthy of the title you bear. I will not marry you, not today, not ever, regardless of what any contract may say." A stunned silence fell over the crowd, broken only by the sound of Lord Pembroke's harsh breathing. His face had turned a deep crimson, and his hand moved to the sword at his hip. For a terrible moment, Isabel thought he might actually try to attack her, king's daughter or not. But then a voice called out from the crowd, strong and clear and achingly familiar. "She speaks the truth, Lord Pembroke, and if you seek to harm her for it, you will have to go through all of us first." Isabel's heart stopped. She knew that voice, had heard it in her dreams every night since their last meeting. She scanned the crowd frantically, searching for its source, and then she saw him. Thomas Brennan stood near the front of the gathering, dressed in the simple brown robes of a monastery novice, but unmistakably himself. He was even more striking than she remembered, his dark hair longer now, brushing his shoulders, his storm-gray eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her breath catch. He looked thinner, as though his time in sanctuary had been difficult, but he stood tall and strong, his presence commanding despite his humble clothing. "You!" Lord Pembroke snarled, wheeling his horse toward Thomas. "You dare show your face here? Guards, arrest that man immediately!" But the crowd surged forward, forming a human wall between Thomas and Lord Pembroke's men. Farmers and craftsmen, people who had never held a sword in their lives, stood shoulder to shoulder, their faces set with determination. It was Margaret who spoke next, her voice carrying the weight of her years and the respect she commanded in the community. "You will not touch him, my lord. Thomas Brennan is under the protection of the monastery, and by extension, the protection of the church. To harm him would be to invite excommunication, and I doubt even you are foolish enough to risk that. Moreover, he has committed no crime. He fled because he was warned that you intended to see him dead or imprisoned on false charges. His only offense was being looked upon with favor by a princess who chose to see him as a man rather than as a peasant." Lord Pembroke looked around at the sea of hostile faces, at the guards who stood uncertainly by the platform, unsure whether to follow his orders or their king's, and at King Richard, whose expression had grown cold and distant. Finally, he seemed to realize that he had lost. that the moment had turned against him irrevocably. "This is not over," he said, his voice thick with barely suppressed rage. "I will take this matter to the High Council. I will demand compensation for the breach of contract, and I will ensure that everyone involved in this farce understands the consequences of defying me." "Then take it to the High Council," King Richard said, his voice hard as iron. "Present your case, demand your compensation, do whatever you feel you must. But understand this, Lord Pembroke. My daughter will not be sold like a piece of property to satisfy your ambitions. The engagement is dissolved, and that is my final word on the matter. Now remove yourself from these proceedings before I have you removed by force." For a moment Lord Pembroke looked as though he might argue further, but something in the king's eyes convinced him otherwise. With a final venomous glare at Isabel and Thomas, he wheeled his horse and rode away, his guards scrambling to follow. A cheer erupted from the crowd, and people began to celebrate in earnest, embracing one another and shouting their approval. But Isabel barely heard it. Her entire focus was on Thomas, who stood watching her with an expression she could not quite read. She wanted to run to him, to throw herself into his arms and never let go, but she was acutely aware of the thousands of eyes upon her, of the impropriety of such a display, and of the fact that her father stood right beside her. As if reading her thoughts, King Richard leaned close and whispered in her ear, "Go to him, daughter. Speak with him. You have earned that much." Isabel looked at her father in surprise, but saw only understanding in his eyes. She descended from the platform, the crowd parting before her like water, until she stood face to face with Thomas Brennan. Up close, she could see the toll that the past weeks had taken on him. There were dark circles under his eyes, and his face was drawn and tired. But when he smiled at her, that same warm smile that had captured her heart at the festival, she felt as though the sun had broken through clouds. "You came back," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I thought you were safe at the monastery. Why would you risk returning?" "Because I heard about what was happening," Thomas replied, his voice rough with emotion. "I heard that you were imprisoned because of me, that the people were rising up in your defense, and I knew I could not hide away while others fought for justice. The monks tried to convince me to stay, said it was too dangerous, but I had to come. I had to see you to make sure you were safe." "You could have been killed," Isabel said, reaching out to touch his face, no longer caring who saw. "Lord Pembroke would have gladly seen you dead." "Some things are worth dying for," Thomas said simply, covering her hand with his own. "You are worth dying for, Isabel. You showed me kindness when you had no reason to, risked everything to save my life, and in doing so, you changed me. I cannot go back to being the man I was before I met you, content to live a small life and never reach for something greater. You inspired me to be brave, to stand up for what I believe in, even when it is terrifying." Isabel felt tears streaming down her face, but she was smiling through them. "And you inspired me to find my voice, to stop accepting what others told me I should be, and start becoming who I truly am. We have both changed each other, Thomas Brennan, and I would not trade that for anything in the world." Around them, the crowd had grown quiet, watching this intimate exchange with rapt attention. Isabel became aware of her father approaching, and she turned to face him, suddenly nervous about how he would react to this display of affection between his daughter and a common blacksmith. But King Richard's expression was thoughtful rather than angry. He studied Thomas for a long moment, taking in the young man's bearing, the way he stood with dignity despite his humble circumstances, the clear intelligence and character evident in his eyes. "Thomas Brennan," the king said formally, "my daughter speaks highly of you, and it seems the people of this realm share her opinion. You risked your life to return here knowing that you might be arrested or worse, simply to stand up for what you believed was right. That takes courage, a quality I have always valued." Thomas bowed deeply, his head lowered in respect. "Your Majesty, I make no claims to nobility or worthiness. I am simply a man who was shown extraordinary kindness by an extraordinary woman, and who could not stand by while she suffered." King Richard nodded slowly, then surprised everyone by placing a hand on Thomas's shoulder. "I have been king for 30 years, and in that time, I have learned that nobility is not always a matter of birth. Sometimes it is a matter of character. I do not know what the future holds for you and my daughter, but I do know this: I will not stand in the way of her happiness again. If she chooses you, then I will respect that choice, regardless of what the nobles and the court may think." A collective gasp went through the crowd, and Isabel felt her knees go weak with relief and joy. Her father was giving his blessing, not in so many words, but the implication was clear. She was free to follow her heart, wherever it might lead. However, King Richard continued, his voice taking on a more practical tone, there are realities we must address. Isabel is still a princess, still heir to certain responsibilities and expectations. If you are to be part of her life, Thomas Brennan, you will need to be prepared for a world that is very different from the one you have known. Are you willing to face that challenge? Thomas looked at Isabel, and in his eyes she saw not hesitation, but determination and love. Your Majesty, I have spent my life working with my hands, shaping iron into useful forms. I do not know much about courts and politics, about proper etiquette and noble customs. But I am willing to learn, willing to adapt, willing to do whatever is necessary to be worthy of your daughter. All I ask is the chance to try. Then you shall have it, King Richard said. He turned to address the crowd, his voice carrying across the courtyard once more. People of this realm, you have witnessed today something remarkable. You have seen a king admit his mistakes, a princess find her voice, and a common man demonstrate uncommon courage. Let this day be remembered not as a rebellion, but as a reminder that justice and compassion must always triumph over tradition and expedience. Go now to your homes and your families, and know that your voices have been heard and your concerns addressed. The crowd began to disperse slowly, reluctantly, as though they were leaving a celebration rather than a political demonstration. People lingered in small groups, discussing what they had witnessed, their faces alive with excitement and hope. Many approached the platform to offer their congratulations and support to Princess Isabel, and she took the time to speak with as many as she could, thanking them for their courage and their loyalty. Margaret pushed through the crowd and embraced Isabel warmly, tears streaming down the healer's weathered face. You did it, Your Highness. You changed the world today, at least a little bit. These people will tell their children and grandchildren about this day, about the princess who stood up for what was right and the king who listened to his people. I could not have done it without you, Isabel replied, gripping the older woman's hands tightly. You kept them peaceful, you delivered my message, and you protected Thomas when he returned. You are a hero, Margaret, and I will never forget what you have done. I am no hero, Margaret said with a self-deprecating smile. I am simply an old woman who has seen too much injustice in her life, and was grateful for the chance to help prevent more. But you, Your Highness, you have a gift for inspiring people. Use it wisely, and you will do great things. As the afternoon wore on, King Richard summoned Isabel, Thomas, and his closest advisors to a private council chamber to discuss the practical implications of what had transpired. The room was smaller and more intimate than the Great Hall, with a round table that suggested equality rather than hierarchy. Catherine was allowed to attend as well, taking her place beside Isabel with quiet dignity. The king's chief advisor, Lord Blackwood, a man of 60 with sharp eyes and a calculating mind, was the first to speak. Your Majesty, while I applaud your compassion and your willingness to listen to your people, we must address the political ramifications of today's events. Lord Pembroke will not let this matter rest. He has allies among the northern lords, and he will use this perceived insult to rally them against the crown. We must be prepared for potential unrest, possibly even armed conflict. King Richard nodded gravely. I am aware of the risks, Blackwood, but I will not make decisions based on fear of what Pembroke might do. If he wishes to challenge me, let him try. I have the support of the people now, and that is worth more than a dozen northern lords. There is also the matter of Princess Isabel's future, interjected Lady Ashford, one of the few noblewomen who served on the king's council. She looked at Isabel with a mixture of curiosity and concern. Your Highness, you have rejected Lord Pembroke, and your father has given his blessing for you to follow your heart. But what does that mean in practical terms? Do you intend to marry Thomas Brennan? And if so, what will your role be? A princess cannot simply become a blacksmith's wife and fade into obscurity. Isabel had been pondering this very question throughout the afternoon, and now, with everyone's eyes upon her, she felt the weight of the decision she was about to make. She looked at Thomas, who sat quietly beside her, his hands clasped on the table before him. He met her gaze steadily, and she saw in his eyes not expectation or pressure, but simply love and support for whatever choice she made. I do intend to marry Thomas, Isabel said clearly, her voice ringing with certainty. Not immediately, for we barely know each other beyond the extraordinary circumstances that brought us together. But I want the opportunity to court him properly, to learn who he is as a person, and to allow him to learn who I am beyond the title and the crown. As for my role, I have been thinking about that as well. She stood and walked to the window, gathering her thoughts. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, and she could see in the distance the villages where the people who had stood up for her today would be returning to their homes. I have spent my entire life being prepared to be a political asset, she continued, turning back to face the council. I have been taught languages and diplomacy, history and statecraft, all with the understanding that I would one day be married off to strengthen some alliance or secure some treaty. But today showed me that there is another way to serve the kingdom, a way that does not require me to sacrifice my own happiness or agency. What are you proposing? King Richard asked, leaning forward with interest. I propose that I become an advocate for the common people, Isabel said, her words coming faster now as the idea took shape. Someone who travels throughout the realm, listening to grievances, mediating disputes, and ensuring that the concerns of farmers and craftsmen and merchants reach the ears of the crown. I could be a bridge between the nobility and the common folk, helping each side understand the other better. And Thomas could accompany me, could use his skills as a blacksmith to help villages that need tools or repairs, while also serving as a reminder that nobility of character matters more than nobility of birth. The council chamber fell silent as everyone absorbed this unprecedented suggestion. Lady Ashford looked intrigued, Lord Blackwood appeared skeptical, and King Richard's expression was unreadable. Finally, the king spoke. It is an interesting idea, daughter, but fraught with challenges. The nobility would see it as a slight, an elevation of the common folk at their expense, and there would be dangers, traveling the realm without the full protection of the royal guard. Then let them see it as a slight, Isabel replied passionately. Perhaps it is time the nobility learned that their privilege comes with responsibility, that they serve at the pleasure of the people, not the other way around. As for danger, I am willing to accept that risk. Life is not meant to be lived in complete safety, sheltered from all possible harm. It is meant to be lived with purpose and meaning. Thomas stood then, his voice respectful but firm. Your Majesty, if I may speak freely, I believe Princess Isabel's proposal has merit. I have lived my entire life among the common people, and I can tell you that they feel invisible to those in power. They work hard, they pay their taxes, they send their sons to fight in wars, and yet their voices go unheard. If the princess were to become that voice, to be their advocate at court, it would build a loyalty and connection between the crown and the people that no amount of military might could create. King Richard studied Thomas for a long moment, and Isabel could see the respect growing in her father's eyes. You speak well for a blacksmith. Tell me, Thomas Brennan, what education have you had? Very little formal education, Your Majesty, Thomas admitted. Master Robert taught me to read and write, and I have read what few books I could acquire over the years. But most of what I know, I learned from living and working among people from all walks of life. A blacksmith's forge is like a gathering place in a village. People come not just for repairs, but to talk, to share news, to seek advice. I have heard the concerns of farmers whose crops are failing, of widows who cannot pay their taxes, of young men who see no future for themselves beyond the same hard labor their fathers endured. These experiences have been my education. Then perhaps your education has been more valuable than that of many nobles who have never set foot outside their comfortable estates. King Richard said thoughtfully. He turned to his council. I want opinions. Lady Ashford, what say you? Lady Ashford considered for a moment, then nodded slowly. I believe it could work, Your Majesty, but it would require careful management. Princess Isabel would need a small retinue, perhaps a dozen guards for protection, a scribe to record the concerns she hears, and advisors who understand both noble and common perspectives. She would also need your authority to make certain decisions on your behalf, to resolve disputes and grant small pardons or dispensations. Without that authority, she would simply be a noble traveling the realm and accomplishing nothing. Those things can be arranged, King Richard said. He looked at Lord Blackwood. And you, old friend? I know you think I am being too soft, too willing to bend to popular pressure. Tell me honestly, do you think this plan is folly? Lord Blackwood sighed heavily, his fingers drumming on the table as he thought, "I think it is unconventional and risky, Your Majesty. But I also think that the world is changing, whether we like it or not. The old ways, where power flowed only from the top down, are becoming less sustainable. People are learning to read, to think, to question authority. Today's events prove that, if we do not adapt, if we do not find ways to include their voices in governance, we will face rebellions far more serious than a peaceful protest. So yes, I think Princess Isabel's proposal has merit, even if it makes me uncomfortable as a traditionalist." King Richard smiled, the first genuine smile Isabel had seen on his face in weeks. "Then it is settled. Isabel, you will have 6 months to prove that this approach can work. You will travel the southern counties first, where the people are generally loyal and the risks are lower. You will take with you a suitable retinue, and you will report back to me regularly on what you learn and what actions you take. If, at the end of 6 months, this experiment proves successful, we will expand it to the rest of the realm." Isabel felt joy surge through her like a physical force. She moved around the table and embraced her father, something she had not done since she was a child. "Thank you, Father. Thank you for trusting me, for believing in me, for giving me this chance." King Richard held her close, and when he spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. "Your mother would be proud of you, Isabel. She always said you had a warrior's heart and a poet's soul. I am only sorry it took me so long to see it." Over the following weeks, preparations were made for Isabel's new role. A small castle in the southern region was designated as her base of operations, a place where she could receive petitioners and coordinate her travels throughout the countryside. The retinue was assembled carefully, with guards chosen for their loyalty and their ability to interact respectfully with common folk, and advisors selected for their knowledge and their open-mindedness. Thomas spent his days learning the customs and protocols of noble life, tutored by Catherine and other patient members of the court. It was clear that he would never be entirely comfortable in such surroundings. His movements were too natural, his speech too direct, his whole bearing too genuine to ever fully adopt the artifice of courtly behavior. But that, Isabel realized, was exactly why he was perfect. He would keep her grounded, would remind her always of the real people they served and the real problems they faced. Their courtship was the subject of endless fascination throughout the kingdom. Some saw it as a beautiful love story, a princess and a commoner defying convention to find happiness together. Others viewed it with suspicion and disapproval, convinced that it represented a dangerous erosion of the social order. But Isabel found that she cared less and less about public opinion with each passing day. What mattered was the time she spent with Thomas, the long conversations where they shared their dreams and fears, the quiet moments where they simply enjoyed each other's company. Lord Pembroke, true to his word, brought his complaint before the High Council, demanding compensation for the broken engagement and accusing King Richard of weakness and favoritism. But the council, swayed by public opinion and by the king's firm resolve, ruled against him. He was awarded a modest sum to soothe his wounded pride, but the engagement remained dissolved. Furious and humiliated, Pembroke retreated to his northern estates, where he spent his time plotting revenge that would never come to fruition. As winter approached and the first snows began to fall, Isabel and Thomas were finally married in a ceremony that broke with every tradition. It was not held in the great cathedral with hundreds of nobles in attendance. Instead, it took place in the small village church of Redbrook, surrounded by the common people who had stood up for Isabel when she needed them most. Margaret officiated alongside the village priest, and Catherine stood as Isabel's witness. Isabel wore not an elaborate gown of silk and jewels, but a simple dress of white wool embroidered with blue flowers, made by the same village seamstress who had made clothes for her disguise weeks earlier. Thomas wore his finest tunic, dark gray wool that brought out the color of his eyes, with a cloak that Isabel had embroidered herself during the long evenings of their courtship. As they exchanged their vows, Isabel looked into Thomas's eyes and saw reflected there everything she had been searching for: partnership, respect, love, and the promise of a future they would build together. When the priest pronounced them married and Thomas kissed her, the small church erupted in cheers and applause, and Isabel felt a completeness she had never known was possible. King Richard attended the wedding, standing quietly at the back of the church, and Isabel saw him wipe away tears when he thought no one was looking. Afterward he embraced them both, welcoming Thomas officially into the family and giving them his blessing for their journey ahead. The months that followed were filled with hard work and profound satisfaction. Isabel and Thomas traveled from village to village throughout the southern counties, listening to people's concerns, resolving disputes, and ensuring that the crown's justice reached even the most remote corners of the realm. Thomas used his skills to repair tools and teach young apprentices, while Isabel used her authority to grant tax relief to struggling families, pardon minor offenses, and address grievances that had been ignored for years. Everywhere they went, they were greeted with warmth and gratitude. People who had never expected to be heard by anyone of importance found themselves sitting across from a princess who genuinely cared about their problems. And they saw in Thomas living proof that it was possible to rise above one's birth circumstances through character and hard work. The reports that Isabel sent back to her father were filled with observations and recommendations that began to shape royal policy. She identified corrupt officials who were abusing their power, discovered inefficiencies in the tax collection system that burdened the poor unfairly, and proposed reforms that would make justice more accessible to everyone. King Richard, to his credit, implemented many of her suggestions, and gradually, the relationship between the crown and the common people began to transform. As spring arrived and the 6-month trial period came to an end, King Richard summoned Isabel and Thomas back to the castle for a formal evaluation. They rode through the gates together, no longer the frightened princess and the fugitive blacksmith, but confident partners who had proven that their unconventional arrangement could work. The great hall was packed once again, but this time the atmosphere was celebratory rather than tense. Nobles and commoners alike had gathered to hear what the king would say, and Isabel felt a flutter of nervousness as she and Thomas took their places before the throne. King Richard stood, and the hall fell silent. 6 months ago, he began, I gave my daughter an unusual assignment. I asked her to serve as an advocate for the common people, to travel the realm and be their voice at court. Many thought I was making a mistake, that I was setting a dangerous precedent and undermining the traditional order. Today I stand before you to declare that I was not mistaken. I was enlightened. He gestured to Isabel. My daughter has shown me that true leadership is not about maintaining power at all costs, but about serving those who depend on you. She has demonstrated that compassion and justice are not weaknesses, but the very foundation upon which a stable and prosperous kingdom must be built. The reports she has sent, the reforms she has recommended, and the loyalty she has inspired in the common folk have all proven that her approach is not just viable, but essential. King Richard descended from his throne and stood before Isabel and Thomas. Therefore, I am officially establishing the position of royal advocate, and I am appointing Princess Isabel to serve in that role permanently. She will have the authority to act in my name throughout the realm, to hear petitions, resolve disputes, and ensure that justice reaches all of my subjects, regardless of their station. And Thomas Brennan, who has served alongside her with dedication and humility, I hereby grant the title of Master Advocate, with all the rights and privileges that title entails. The hall erupted in applause, and Isabel felt tears of joy streaming down her face. She looked at Thomas, who appeared stunned but deeply moved, and they embraced there before the entire court, no longer caring about propriety or tradition. As the celebration continued around them, King Richard pulled Isabel aside for a private word. I am proud of you, daughter. More proud than I have ever been of anything in my life. You took a terrible situation and transformed it into something beautiful and meaningful. You have changed not just your own life, but the lives of thousands of people throughout this kingdom. That is a legacy worth far more than any political alliance or royal marriage could ever have been. I could not have done it without you, Father, Isabel replied, squeezing his hand. Thank you for having the courage to admit you were wrong, for listening to your people, and for giving me the freedom to become who I was meant to be. And thank you for teaching an old king new tricks, Richard said with a smile. Now go, enjoy your celebration. You have earned it. As the evening wore on, Isabel found herself standing once again at the window of her old chamber, looking out at the kingdom spread before her. But this time, she was not alone. Thomas stood beside her, his arm around her waist, and together they watched the sunset over the realm they would continue to serve. Do you ever regret it? Thomas asked quietly. Giving up the life you could have had, the comfort and security of a traditional royal marriage? Isabel turned to face him, cupping his face in her hands. I regret nothing. You showed me what it means to live authentically, to follow my heart even when the path is uncertain. Together we have built something meaningful, something that will outlast us both. How could I possibly regret that? Thomas kissed her then, a long tender kiss that spoke of love and partnership and a future filled with purpose. And as they stood there in the fading light, Isabel knew with absolute certainty that she had made the right choice. She had defied convention, challenged authority, and risked everything for love and justice. And in doing so, she had not just found happiness for herself, but had helped create a better world for everyone. The story of the princess who loved a peasant and the kingdom that rose up to defend that love would be told for generations to come. It would inspire others to question unjust traditions, to stand up for what they believed in, and to remember that nobility of character matters far more than nobility of birth. And it would serve as a reminder that even in the darkest moments, when all seems lost, courage and compassion can change the world. Isabel and Thomas continued their work as royal advocates for many years, traveling throughout the realm and touching countless lives with their dedication and kindness. They had children who grew up understanding that privilege came with responsibility, and that true honor was found in service rather than power. And when they were old and their traveling days were behind them, they retired to a small cottage in Redbrook, the village where their story had begun, surrounded by the people who had believed in them from the very start. King Richard ruled wisely until his death, implementing reforms that made the kingdom more just and equitable. And when Prince Henry ascended to the throne after him, he continued his sister's legacy, maintaining the position of royal advocate and ensuring that the voice of the common people was always heard at court. The tale of Princess Isabel and Thomas Brennan became legend, a story of love conquering prejudice, of courage overcoming fear, and of two people who dared to imagine a different world and then worked tirelessly to make that vision reality. It was a story that proved that sometimes the most revolutionary act is simply choosing to see the humanity in others, regardless of their station or circumstance. And it was a story that reminded everyone who heard it that true love, grounded in mutual respect and shared values, could indeed change the world. As the stars appeared in the darkening sky above Thornhaven Castle, Isabel rested her head on Thomas's shoulder, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat and the warmth of his embrace. She thought about the long journey that had brought them to this moment, about the obstacles they had overcome and the battles they had fought, both external and internal. And she smiled, knowing that every struggle had been worth it, that every risk had led them exactly where they needed to be. For in choosing love over duty, compassion over convention, and authenticity over expectation, Isabel had not just found her own happiness. She had sparked a transformation that would ripple through the kingdom for generations, proving that even a single act of courage could change the course of history. And as she drifted off to sleep in Thomas's arms, she knew that their story was not just their own, but belonged to everyone who had ever dared to hope for something better, to fight for something true, and to believe that love, in all its forms, was the most powerful force in the world.